The Forum stood as it always had, weathered by time, echoing with the murmur of voices both high and low, the creak of carts, the tramp of sandals on stone. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, nothing outwardly marked it as different. The awnings over the Curia of Pompey stretched taut against the rising Roman sun, casting long shadows on the marble columns. Market traders arranged their figs and olives. A senator adjusted his purple-striped toga. In a world so carefully built on ritual and rhythm, deviation was rarely visible until it became fate. History, as we remember it, tells us that Julius Caesar was warned. The soothsayer, the haruspices, the subtle shudder in the flight of birds, all had cautioned him. Yet he went. He walked into the theater of Pompey, where Brutus, Cassius, and more than 60 others awaited him, daggers hidden beneath their cloaks, grievances sharper than their blades. But let us now imagine that history turned gently, almost imperceptibly, like the slow turning of a weather vane in a wind just barely strong enough to register. Let us imagine that on that very morning, an interruption occurred. An ambassador delayed his entry, or Calpurnia's dream proved more persuasive, or perhaps Mark Antony intercepted a whisper of conspiracy. We shall never know which precise mechanism might have caused Caesar to delay his steps or divert his route. But in this speculative dream, this lullaby for the mind, he does not enter the Curia. The blades remain unused. The blood is never spilled. The cry of "Et tu, Brute" is never uttered. Instead, Caesar returns to the Domus Publica, his official residence as Pontifex Maximus, and considers the letter in his hand. It is from the east, news from Syria, unrest among Parthian border tribes. His thoughts turn, as they often do, toward future campaigns, future reforms, the architecture of posterity. Rome awaits, breathless, but it will not know today what it almost lost. In this altered world, Caesar lives, and from this single deferral of death, an empire reshapes itself slowly, inexorably, like marble softened under centuries of rain. One must first understand the fragile psychology of the conspirators. Brutus, noble in lineage, tormented in spirit, was motivated less by personal ambition and more by a desperate clinging to ideals passed down from ancestors who had expelled Rome's kings. Cassius, more pragmatic, feared the consolidation of power in the hands of one man. Others varied. Some resented Caesar's clemency, others his reformist agenda, many his indifference to tradition. Their unity, if it could be called that, was built not on shared goals, but on shared anxiety. Now, without the assassination, that unity crumbles. The conspiracy begins to fracture under the weight of inaction. Some members fear discovery and seek to ingratiate themselves with Caesar anew. Others, Brutus among them, remain paralyzed, unsure whether to try again or retreat in shame. The Senate, still wary, still humiliated by Caesar's disregard for its dignity, hesitates. But Caesar has returned to his chambers not to punish, but to plan. In the quiet of that afternoon he writes, What might such a letter contain? Perhaps a set of decrees outlining land reform, continued resettlement of veterans in the provinces, intended both to reward loyalty and dilute urban unrest. Perhaps he addresses currency stabilization, seeking to prevent the hyperinflation that had plagued Rome since the civil wars. Or maybe, most prescient of all, he begins to chart a new legal code, an enduring system intended to outlast any individual man. As the days pass, the missed assassination recedes into a fog of rumor. Was there truly a plot? Did Caesar know? Did Mark Antony's sudden summons to Caesar in the Forum prevent a tragedy? The truth becomes a whispered thing, unprovable, half-remembered, and Caesar, shrewd as ever, neither confirms nor denies. In this ambiguity, he finds power. A curious transformation begins in his demeanor. The Caesar who had crossed the Rubicon was decisive, martial, commanding. The Caesar who survived the Ides becomes something else, more restrained, more deliberate. Historians in this alternate thread might later debate whether the near-death experience humbled him or merely deepened his strategy. Regardless, he begins to rule with greater subtlety. He makes overtures to the Senate, restoring a few lost honors, inviting once disgraced members back into civic life. It is not repentance, it is theater. The audience, both Roman and provincial, sees the spectacle of unity, and in seeing, believes. Slowly, the Senate's role morphs from adversarial to ceremonial, like the British monarchy of later centuries, still respected, but fundamentally powerless. The people, too, begin to shift. Caesar expands grain distributions, commissions vast public works, temples, baths, aqueducts. He understands, as no general before him truly had, that bread and spectacle are the twin pillars of urban stability. Yet he also seeks legacy, not merely admiration, but permanence. He reestablishes the census, encourages Latinization in the provinces, and promotes public education through the patronage of philosophical academies. It is a quiet revolution, bloodless, bureaucratic, and far more dangerous to republicanism than any battle. The institutions of the Republic, though still present, are now clothed in new meanings. The res publica remains in name, but not in function. Caesar, never officially crowned king, becomes monarch in all but title. Meanwhile, the conspirators disperse like leaves in wind. Brutus retreats to private life, writes philosophical treatises, and refuses political office. Cassius accepts a provincial governorship, perhaps in Asia Minor or Crete, where he remains watched but unmolested. Others fade entirely, their legacies erased by inaction. In this reimagined Rome, the idea of Caesar begins to swell. Statues multiply. Coins bear not only his visage, but divine epithets. Divus Julius, Pater Patriae. A subtle but significant shift occurs. Where once Roman leaders were servants of the res publica, now the state itself begins to present as an extension of the man. It is in this atmosphere that Cleopatra returns, not as a political inconvenience, but as an honored guest. Her son, Caesarion, now perhaps 4 or 5 years old, is introduced at court in Rome. He is presented not as a foreign curiosity, but as a child of union, of East and West, of Nile and Tiber. Caesar does not yet name him heir, but neither does he hide the boy from public view. Speculation grows, carefully managed by Caesar's inner circle. The idea of dynastic succession, long anathema to Roman sensibilities, begins to take root through the most Roman of practices: repetition, ritual, familiarity. As year gives way to year, the memory of the Ides becomes folklore. Schoolchildren debate whether it truly happened. Playwrights stage dramatic interpretations, some comedic, others tragic, all speculative. The assassination that never was becomes legend, while the Caesar who lives becomes law. The ripples of this survival reach outward across the Mediterranean. In Gaul, stability deepens. In Hispania, commerce thrives. In Africa, Roman governance becomes more integrated. Caesar's policies of enfranchisement, once controversial, now appear prescient. Citizenship expands, slowly but deliberately, creating a new class of loyal provincial elites who owe their rise not to noble lineage, but to imperial favor. And thus, the great arc of Roman history bends not towards Augustus, but towards something stranger, an empire formed not through reactive succession, but through Caesar's own prolonged design. No second triumvirate, no prescriptions, no civil war, no Philippi, no Actium, no Octavian rising from obscurity. Instead, a single will, uninterrupted, reshaping the world as Rome reshaped its provinces. What then becomes of liberty, of tradition, of resistance? These questions linger like incense in the Curia. But the people sleep soundly beneath their marble porticos. The Forum is swept clean each morning, and the stars wheel overhead in silence, as they always have, indifferent to whether one man lives or dies. But history, in this vision, remembers that he lived. The word peace, in Roman terms, rarely suggested the absence of violence. Rather, it implied the management of disorder, the subjugation of rebellion, and the controlled flow of power. It was not serenity, but supremacy. The Pax Romana that would later emerge under Augustus was a construct, carefully curated in retrospect. Yet, in this alternate flow of time, with Julius Caesar alive beyond the Ides, a different peace emerges, one perhaps more fragile in its inception, but broader in ambition and deeper in design. It would be called the Pax Caesarea, the peace of Caesar, not merely an absence of war, but a reordering of the Roman world under a single enduring vision. It began, as so many lasting regimes do, not with proclamations, but with policies. Following the near assassination, Caesar moved slowly, deliberately, and with characteristic shrewdness. He understood that vengeance, though tempting, would fracture his newly stabilized state. The Senate was bruised, the elite wary, and the people attentive. There was no need for retribution. There was only need for reform. One of Caesar's earliest acts in this new era was the quiet reorganization of land distribution. The veterans who had followed him across Gaul, through the Rubicon, into the halls of power, were rewarded with dignity, not with chaotic confiscations, but with planned resettlement. Entire districts in Gaul and Hispania were redesigned to accommodate Roman military retirees, who now served not with the sword, but with the plow. These men became the backbone of rural stability, loyal not to a distant Senate, but to the hand that had placed them on the land. Urban policy followed. Rome itself, overpopulated, underemployed, and prone to unrest, became the subject of intense planning. Caesar commissioned the expansion of grain distributions, which soothed the masses. But more significantly, he invested heavily in public employment. New temples rose not merely for worship, but as political statements. Baths, libraries, and forums were built with remarkable haste, giving idle hands purpose and idle minds distraction. Bread and spectacle, yes, but also labor and identity. The city changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Rome of bricks and grime became a Rome of marble and marbleized thought. The very stones began to echo with the notion that Rome was no longer a republic, but a civilization incarnate in a single individual. Caesar's reforms extended far beyond the urbs. Provincial governance, often the playground of corrupt officials and exploitative tax collectors, underwent bureaucratic transformation. Governors were now vetted more rigorously, their terms limited, their powers checked by imperial auditors dispatched directly from Caesar's office. Corruption, though never fully extinguished, became a dangerous profession. The provinces, long seen as distant holdings to be drained, were instead treated as limbs of the Roman body, integral, nourished, and expected to contribute. To facilitate this transformation, Caesar expanded Roman citizenship further than ever before. In Hispania and Gaul, entire communities were granted civitas. Latin became not merely a language of rulers, but of aspiration. Local elites sent their sons to Rome for education, seeking not to resist Romanization, but to embrace it as a path to power. A provincial aristocracy emerged, loyal, Latin-speaking, and deeply invested in Caesar's vision. Economic measures reinforced the peace. Currency, which had suffered inflation through decades of conflict, was stabilized through measured silver content and consistent minting. Caesar's control over the treasury was absolute, and he used it not merely to fund spectacle, but to reduce public debt, regularize tax collection, and enforce price ceilings on critical commodities. This economic predictability, rare in any ancient world, gave Rome the semblance of modernity. And yet, for all these measures, the peace remained fragile in perception. The Senate still existed, though increasingly ceremonial. There remained within its marbled halls a residue of republican thought, a longing for past dignity, a bitterness at irrelevance. Caesar knew this. He also knew that suppression would spark rebellion, so instead, he co-opted. Key senators were given religious appointments, honorary roles, and oversight of grand public events. Their robes were still purple, their names still spoken in official ceremonies, but their authority had become theater. Caesar's genius lay not in abolishing tradition, but in hollowing it and filling it with new meaning. The Roman people accepted this, not with rebellion, but with relief. After decades of war, Sulla, Marius, Pompey, Crassus, the Civil War, the arrival of structure was soothing. The common citizen cared little for the ideological scaffolding of the Republic. What they craved was food, security, and order. Caesar delivered all three, and in doing so, won the quiet consent of the masses. Peace, then, extended its fingers into culture. Caesar, ever concerned with legacy, became patron to poets, historians, and architects. He commissioned Virgil to begin work on a great epic, not the Aeneid, perhaps, but something similar in ambition, a mythologized past that would root his regime in divine providence and Trojan heritage. Livy was encouraged to write his histories, not merely as chronicles, but as moral justifications for Caesarian governance. The arts flourished, theaters expanded, sculpture regained its Hellenistic grandeur. Rome, which had once mimicked Greece, now asserted its own aesthetic, stoic, imperial, permanent. Statues of Caesar multiplied across the empire, not merely as depictions, but as messages. In stone, bronze, and coin, the empire began to speak in unison. Caesar est Roma. Legions, too, found new purpose. With civil war no longer a threat, military action turned outward. Caesar restructured the legions, standardizing equipment, increasing pay, and formalizing the chain of command. Loyalty was ensured not just through oaths, but through vested interests, land, pension, and prestige. Legions were stationed along the Rhine, in Asia Minor, in North Africa, not as instruments of repression, but as symbols of permanence. In this climate, Caesar turned once again to Parthia. Long had the memory of Crassus's humiliating defeat at Carrhae haunted Roman pride. Caesar, in his new role as unchallenged commander-in-chief, began preparations for a grand campaign, not merely for revenge, but for legacy. He envisioned a Roman East stretching to the Tigris, secured through alliances, outposts, and controlled client kingships. Logistics were calculated, roads planned, diplomats dispatched in advance. The war would not be merely one of conquest, but of systematization. If Gaul could be Romanized, why not Mesopotamia? But before the march began, Caesar chose to stabilize the internal peace further. A comprehensive census was conducted, Rome's first in over 2 decades. It cataloged not merely citizens, but property, lineage, and regional productivity. With this data, taxation became fairer, more efficient. Representation in local governance, though still heavily Roman, adapted subtly to provincial demographics. The empire began to govern itself under the watchful eye of Caesar's central administration. Religious policy also matured. Caesar, already Pontifex Maximus, embraced a syncretic approach. Egyptian deities were not outlawed, but integrated. Temples to Isis rose in Rome, not as foreign oddities, but as expressions of unity. Caesar understood religion's function not merely as belief, but as binding agent. He encouraged a civic faith, an imperial cult that, while stopping short of full deification, aligned his authority with divine favor. The people complied, some with enthusiasm, most with indifference. Piety, like politics, was absorbed into the imperial form. As years passed, the children born after the Ides of March grew up in a world that had never known a murdered dictator, never heard of Philippi, never witnessed the rise of Octavian. They knew only Caesar, the peacemaker, the builder, the lawgiver. Their teachers recited not Cato's speeches, but Caesar's commentaries. Their holidays celebrated victories not only of war, but of engineering, agriculture, and administration. This, then, was the Pax Caesarea, not perfect, not entirely bloodless, but enduring. Its foundations lay not in ideology, but in competence, not in democratic ideals, but in effective autocracy. For those who value liberty, it was perhaps a long twilight, but for the majority, it was light at last after decades of chaos. The roads grew quiet, the harbors filled with ships, the markets hummed, the temples rang with prayer, and in the shadow of the Capitol, beneath the banners bearing his laurel-crowned image, Julius Caesar ruled, not as tyrant, not as king, but as the architect of peace. There are times in history when the transformation of a state is not announced by trumpet or decree, but arrives like mist across a field, barely perceptible until it has entirely enveloped the landscape. So it was with Rome under the prolonged life and leadership of Gaius Julius Caesar. While the word rex remained anathema to Roman ears, the substance of kingship crept, silent and unresisted, into every organ of the Roman state. To grasp the subtlety of this shift, one must understand the Roman psyche, a consciousness shaped by centuries of anti-monarchical sentiment. The expulsion of the Tarquins in 509 BCE had birthed the Republic, and with it, a cultural memory that rejected concentrated hereditary power. From that foundational trauma arose a constitution of checks and balances, 2 consuls, annually elected, a senate of patricians, assemblies of plebeians, laws codified not for the benefit of the few, but for the many, at least in theory. Yet by the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the machinery of the Republic had already begun to falter. The civil wars, the extraordinary commands, the erosion of senatorial dignity, all had laid the groundwork for what was to come. Caesar did not break the Republic. He simply ensured that it would not rise again. After the failed assassination, Caesar moved with caution. He knew that assuming the title of king would trigger revolt, not merely among the aristocracy, but among the populace, who had been conditioned to see kingship as synonymous with tyranny. He therefore sought not to name himself king, but to enact kingship functionally, layer by layer, privilege by privilege, until the word became irrelevant. He began with term length. As dictator, his powers had traditionally been confined to 6 months, reserved for emergencies. In 49 BCE, he had extended this to a year. In 48 BCE, to 10 years. By 44 BCE, he had been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. It was a title without precedent, cloaked in republican language, yet monarchical in every practical respect. And in this timeline, untroubled by daggers and conspiracies, this title endured and evolved. The term dictator slowly receded in usage, not out of legal reform, but out of social fatigue. The people, in time, simply called him Caesar. He further separated himself from his contemporaries through visual language. The laurel wreath, originally a symbol of military triumph, became permanent upon his brow. He began to wear a long purple robe, not just during ceremonies, but in daily functions, a hue traditionally reserved for Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Statues began to depict him seated, holding the scepter of authority, his face solemn, eyes upward, a mortal cast in divine posture. The Senate, whether out of fear, flattery, or fatigue, offered little resistance. The coins bore witness. Once the face of the Republic itself had been an abstract personification, Roma, helmeted, and noble. Now Caesar's profile appeared, serene and confident, accompanied by inscriptions such as Pater Patriae, Divus Julius, and Perpetuo Dictator. Never the word rex, and yet no monarch ever required a clearer signature than this. Legal authority followed visual authority. Caesar, who had long promised a revision of the Roman legal code, finally commenced the task in earnest. The 12 tables remained a foundation, but they were supplemented by an expansive corpus of regulations, edicts, and rulings issued directly from the Caesarian administration. Provincial governors were instructed to interpret law not only in accordance with tradition, but with reference to Caesarian precedent, a subtle shift, yet profound. Law no longer stemmed from collective deliberation, but from the interpretation of one man's will. He restructured the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman political advancement. Offices that had once been earned through elections now required approval from Caesar's central committee. In many cases, candidates were selected outright. Age limits were relaxed for favorites. Senators found themselves bypassed, replaced by equestrians and provincial elites whose loyalty was to the man, not to the Senate. This, too, was monarchy, not a name, but in mechanism. Caesar also redefined succession, not explicitly, but atmospherically. He never named a clear heir, preferring to let the matter remain ambiguous. Yet he surrounded himself with young protégés, particularly Caesarion, his son by Cleopatra, who was increasingly presented to the public as a figure of imperial curiosity. The boy was taught Latin and Greek, dressed in Roman attire, and escorted to public games by high-ranking officials. While no formal announcement was made, the message was clear. The future was being shaped. The Senate responded not with rebellion, but with compliance. Its members, many of whom owed their fortunes and positions to Caesar, found that resistance offered nothing but obscurity. Instead, they embraced their new role, not as legislators, but as dignitaries, stewards of heritage, presiders over rituals. They passed decrees not to limit Caesar, but to honor him. One such decree declared that his birthday be marked by public games. Another elevated his residence to sacred status. Another permitted the erection of a temple in his name while he still lived, a privilege once reserved only for the dead. Religion became the final pillar of monarchy. Caesar, already Pontifex Maximus, began to centralize religious authority. Temples were funded through the imperial treasury. Priests were appointed not through collegial election, but through imperial nomination. The boundaries between civic ritual and personal cult blurred. Festivals in honor of Caesar grew more elaborate. His image was carried in processions alongside those of Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. Children sang hymns that praised Rome not as a republic, but as the chosen empire of Caesar's peace. And yet, the word king was never used. Even as he took on the trappings of sovereignty, Caesar continued to speak of the res publica, a term that had by now lost its substance, but retained its rhetorical power. His edicts began in accordance with the laws of the republic. His speeches referred to the will of the Senate and people of Rome. The illusion of shared governance was preserved, like the shell of a temple, long since emptied of its gods. But the people were not deceived. They simply did not care. What mattered was stability, food, employment, and predictability. The memory of civil war remained sharp. The names of Sulla, Marius, Pompey, names once associated with chaos, were now invoked as cautionary tales. By contrast, Caesar brought order. That order had a price, the disappearance of republican liberty. But liberty had, for many, been an abstraction. The loyalty of the people lay not with the Senate, but with the man who ruled, provided, and endured. There were, of course, whispers. In the private chambers of aristocratic villas, over wine and under torchlight, some spoke of what had been lost. The mos maiorum, the ancestral customs, had been eroded. The dignity of debate, the honor of free magistracy, the ideal of civic equality, all diminished. But these were whispers, not shouts, and they remained confined to marble rooms, not marble steps. Perhaps the greatest testament to Caesar's achievement was how little opposition arose. He did not need purges, prescriptions, or widespread executions. He ruled not through terror, but through design. He did not destroy the republic. He allowed it to empty itself. And in its hollow shell, he placed the apparatus of monarchy, ceremonial, hereditary, sacralized, without ever needing to declare it. It is said that a throne need not be called a throne to wield the authority of one. In Caesar's Rome, the throne was invisible, but all bowed before it. As the years passed, the children of Rome no longer studied Cincinnatus or Camillus. They learned of Caesar's victories in Gaul, his reforms, his wisdom. They drew his profile in clay. They memorized his speeches. They recited civic oaths in his name. He became not merely a leader, but an idea, an institution. And so monarchy returned to Rome, not with the clang of swords or the wail of mourning, but with silence, patience, and ceremony. A monarchy without crown, without title, but with all the permanence of stone. The republic was dead, but no one could say precisely when it had died. To speak of Cleopatra within the context of Caesar's continued life is to conjure not simply the image of a queen, but of a queen transformed by time, position, and design. History has often reduced her to an archetype, seductress, sorceress, sovereign of Nile and night. But in truth, she was a monarch of singular intelligence, shrewd diplomacy, and political dexterity. In the world where Caesar did not die in the Curia of Pompey, Cleopatra emerges not as a peripheral mistress, but as the mother of imperial continuity. The path of dynastic Rome is redrawn in the contours of a union neither formally acknowledged nor politically repudiated. When Cleopatra had first arrived in Rome in 46 BCE, she was met with a curiosity bordering on unease. To the Roman elite, her presence symbolized danger, foreignness, power, female autonomy. And yet, Caesar received her not only as an ally, but as a guest of honor. He hosted her in a villa across the Tiber, offered her protection, and conducted private consultations well beyond the expectations of diplomacy. The birth of their son, Ptolemy XIII, Philopator Philometor Caesar, known more famously as Caesarion, was an open secret, tolerated but not embraced. But that was in the timeline of Caesar's assassination. In this world where the daggers never found flesh, Cleopatra's role subtly but unmistakably shifts. Her presence in Rome lengthens. No longer merely a royal visitor, she becomes a familiar figure at public ceremonies, seated discreetly yet visibly among Rome's most influential matrons. Her attire, carefully chosen, blends Egyptian finery with Roman modesty. She speaks Latin fluently, albeit with an Alexandrian cadence. The people, initially cautious, grow accustomed. She is no longer the queen of the Nile. She becomes quietly the consort of Caesar. And Caesarion? He is no longer hidden. The child, perhaps 5 or 6 in this period of imagined peace, is presented at festivals, processions, and triumphal games. Not as heir, Caesar is careful never to speak that word, but as Filius Caesarus, son of Caesar. It is a subtle but potent declaration. In Republican Rome, fatherhood did not confer automatic succession, but this Rome is no longer republican in spirit. It is monarchical in all but declaration. The people begin to see Caesarion as a symbol of continuity. His curls, his bearing, his composure, all remarked upon. He is tutored by the finest grammarians, walks alongside senators' sons, and appears in art beside his father. Where once Rome recoiled from the idea of dynastic succession, it now quietly acclimates. Cleopatra's influence grows not only through her proximity to Caesar, but through her utility. She is no idle queen. She advises on trade between Alexandria and Ostia, reopens shipping lanes disrupted by piracy, and offers the Egyptian grain supply as a tool of leverage and goodwill. Rome, which has long feared famine, grows increasingly dependent on Nile wheat. Cleopatra ensures that this dependence is met not with resentment, but with admiration. Her role becomes indispensable, and indispensability in politics is the currency of permanence. Within the Senate, there are murmurs. Some recall the chaos of Antony and Cleopatra in the timeline now lost to time. They whisper of Eastern decadence, of Rome corrupted by silks and incense, of a queen who seeks to enthrone her son upon the capital. But their whispers remain impotent. Caesar rules unchallenged, and those who speak too loudly of disapproval find themselves assigned governorships in distant provinces. Honors in name, exiles in practice. The cultural synthesis begins. Temples to Isis, long a marginal cult among Roman women and freedmen, receive new funding. Rituals, once confined to nocturnal ceremonies, are now practiced under the open sun. Vestal virgins exchange processions with Egyptian priestesses during festival days. Philosophers from Alexandria, experts in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, are invited to lecture at Roman academies. Greek, already the language of the educated elite, is now joined by subtle infusions of Egyptian symbolism in poetry, jewelry, and civic art. Cleopatra does not impose, she influences. And through her influence, the foundations of a new Roman identity begin to take shape, an empire not merely ruling the Mediterranean, but blending it. The question of Caesarion's future remains carefully unspoken by Caesar, yet omnipresent in the minds of Rome's thinkers, senators, and citizens. In private, Caesar begins to formalize a succession strategy, not through decree, but through precedent. He restructures the consular elections to allow Caesarian honorary consulships at a future age. He creates a new office, Princeps Juventutis, first among the youth, a ceremonial title granted to no one, but clearly awaiting a single recipient. He ensures Caesarion's legal status as a Roman citizen, despite the child being born in Egypt. And he arranges for the boy's tutelage under the Stoics, grounding him not in luxury, but in Roman discipline. In time, Cleopatra is granted a villa on the Palatine, near the residence of the Pontifex Maximus. She does not hold public office, but attends all imperial ceremonies. She appears beside Caesar during diplomatic receptions. Her voice is heard in matters of the East, not officially, but influentially. She becomes an empress in all but name. The implications are vast. The marriage of Rome and Egypt, once the fever dream of Eastern propagandists, becomes a material fact. The Ptolemaic line, instead of perishing with Cleopatra's suicide and Augustus's annexation, continues through Caesarion. Alexandria retains autonomy, but it is no longer a rival capital. It becomes a second pole of imperial gravity, a center of knowledge, ritual, and economic policy, all flowing toward Rome. Other kingdoms take note. Armenia courts Rome more fervently, hoping to gain favor with the imperial family. Judea, still under the rule of Herod, strengthens its alliance with Caesar, sending ambassadors with elaborate gifts. Numidia and Mauritania offer tributes far in excess of obligation. The emperor is not merely feared, but honored, because he is now dynastically grounded. The fear of chaos, civil war, and disputed succession has evaporated. In its place stands a child with bloodlines from Romulus and the Pharaohs. Of course, there are quiet resistances. Stoic philosophers question the nature of monarchy. Senators hold private symposia to discuss the lost virtues of the republic. Republican graffiti appears in dark corners of the Aventine, but none of it matters. The people are fed, the legions are paid, the cities are adorned, the imperial couple are serene. It is perhaps during the Ludi Romani of 40 BCE that the transformation becomes irrevocable. A golden chariot, drawn by white horses, enters the Circus Maximus. Within it stand Caesar and Cleopatra, hand in hand, garlanded in laurel and lotus. Behind them rides the young Caesarion, dressed in a white tunic trimmed with gold. The crowd roars, flowers are thrown, music rises. And for the first time in Roman history, an imperial family parades not as victors over enemies, but as architects of peace. No proclamation is made, no crown is worn. And yet, from that day onward, the image of Roman leadership has changed. Caesar will rule for many years more, but his legacy now extends beyond conquest and reform. He is the founder of a dynasty, a father not merely of the state, but of an heir. Cleopatra, once viewed with suspicion, becomes revered. Statues rise in both Rome and Alexandria, depicting her with outstretched arms flanked by eagles and cobras, holding scrolls, symbols of wisdom and power. Caesarion grows in shadow and in sunlight. He recites Virgil and Homer, studies under Roman generals and Egyptian priests, trains in rhetoric, horsemanship, and geometry. By the time he reaches adolescence, few doubt his destiny. Rome has accepted what it once feared, that power, to endure, must be inherited. That rule, to be stable, must be bloodbound. That Caesar, though not called king, has founded a royal house. And so, in the union of Rome and Egypt, of eagle and lotus, of Latin and hieroglyph, a new world takes shape. A world that does not abandon the Republic in a single stroke, but allows it to fade, gently, inevitably, into the corridors of memory. A world where Caesar lives, and through Cleopatra and Caesarion does not die. If the sword wins the empire, the law cements it. Conquest may carve the frontiers of a civilization, but it is only through statutes, codes, decrees, and precedent that the fabric of daily life is sewn together, binding people not with force, but with regulation, not with threat, but with order. For Julius Caesar, who, in this alternate timeline, survived his would-be assassins, law became not merely a tool of governance, but an instrument of immortality. His conquests had won Gaul, his reforms would win time. In the world we know, Caesar's legal legacy is modest in volume, overshadowed by his death and the chaos that followed. But here, in a Rome unfractured by civil war, uninterrupted by his assassination, Caesar undertakes one of the most ambitious projects of his reign, the comprehensive reformation of Roman law, administration, and civic structure. He begins, as he often does, not with grandeur, but with census. The census of 43 BCE is the first in decades to be conducted with imperial authority and imperial precision. Over the course of 2 years, agents of Caesar fan out across the Roman world, from the wine hills of Etruria to the market towns of Gaul, from the villas of Hispania to the tenements of Ostia, cataloging every citizen, every property, every temple, every workshop. The census is not a mere enumeration, but a map of the empire's soul. With it comes data: who owns what, who owes what, who lives where, and under which laws. This information becomes the spine of Caesar's legal project. From this body of knowledge emerges the Lex Julia, a sweeping set of reforms named not for the Senate that ratified them, but for the man who conceived, commissioned, and implemented them. The Lex Julia is not a single law, but a living, growing codex, a constellation of statutes, directives, and ordinances, each bearing the stamp of Caesar's new magistracy, Prefectus Legum, or prefect of laws. The reforms are sweeping. First comes land law. For centuries, disputes over property had clogged Roman courts and stoked rural unrest. Now, under Caesar's direction, land ownership is surveyed, formalized, and recorded in a new system of tabulae agraria, official agricultural records. Disputes are arbitrated by imperial assessors. Deeds are written on wax, copied onto stone, and deposited in public archives. Boundaries are marked with bronze posts bearing Caesar's name. The empire, once a patchwork of private holdings and overlapping claims, becomes legible. Then follows family law. Marriage, inheritance, and guardianship are all revised. The Lex Julia de Familia et Hereditas mandates that all unions be registered with the local magistrate. Dowries must be declared. Wills must be witnessed and sealed with a public notary. Illegitimate children, once cast into the gray periphery of Roman law, are given rights of inheritance under certain conditions. The role of the paterfamilias, though still respected, is now subject to legal limitations, particularly in matters of punishment and expulsion. The household, once an island of autocracy, becomes a microcosm of imperial law. Commerce and trade come next. The Lex Julia de Negotiis Publicis establishes standards for weights and measures across the empire. A central minting authority regulates coinage, eliminating the inconsistencies that had plagued provincial economies. Contracts are now enforceable across jurisdictions, thanks to a new system of registered trade documents. The Forum transforms from a chaotic bazaar into a regulated financial center. Moneylenders, often reviled, are now subject to caps on interest and imperial oversight. Credit is standardized, and bankruptcy, once a death sentence, is formalized as a legal process. In the domain of crime and punishment, Caesar introduces measured reform. The traditional punishments, flogging, exile, crucifixion, are retained but reined in. Trials become more structured. The role of the iudex, or judge, is professionalized. Caesar establishes an imperial law school on the Capitoline Hill, where jurists study not only precedent, but philosophy and rhetoric. Legal advocates are certified and regulated, creating an early form of the bar. Popular assemblies lose their role in criminal trials, replaced by panels of appointed magistrates. Justice, while still harsh by modern standards, becomes more predictable, less arbitrary. Perhaps most radical of all is citizenship law. Caesar's vision of Rome is not one of an urban elite ruling over subject peoples, but of a graded hierarchy of integration. Under the Lex Julia de Civitate, provincial leaders, soldiers, merchants, and landholders can earn full Roman citizenship through service, education, or loyalty. The empire becomes a ladder rather than a cage. With each new grant of citizenship, Rome's identity expands. A Gaul may now vote in local assemblies. A Spaniard may plead before a Roman court. A Greek teacher may serve as a magistrate. The empire ceases to be merely Roman. It becomes Romanized. To administer this swelling complexity, Caesar creates the Praefectura Urbana, an urban prefecture that oversees legal administration, census data, taxation, and civic order in each major provincial city. Each prefectus reports directly to Rome and is trained in Caesar's law school. They are not local aristocrats, but loyal functionaries, loyal not to custom, but to Caesar. Bureaucracy, often seen as the enemy of empire, becomes its salvation. The result is a Rome that no longer governs merely by tradition and precedent, but by design. Caesar's laws are etched in bronze, posted in forms, and taught in schools. The Lex Julia becomes not just a set of laws, but an identity. To be Roman is to live under Roman law, to speak in its terms, to believe in its order. Education follows suit. Caesar sponsors a network of public schools, ludi publici, in every major town. Latin becomes the language of administration, Greek the language of philosophy. Children learn the law as part of their grammar. Rhetoric is taught not merely as performance, but as civic duty. Even the lowest citizens are expected to understand their rights. Law becomes literacy, and literacy becomes law. Clerks are trained, records are kept, taxes are collected not by force, but by formula. Appeals are heard, petitions are read. A woman in Lusitania may file a grievance against her neighbor. A freedman in Asia Minor may challenge a fine. A merchant in Tripolitania may cite the Lex Julia in his defense. Across continents, the empire begins to pulse with a single rhythm, not military, but legal. Caesar is tireless. He holds weekly audiences, receives petitions, dictates responses. His scribes cannot keep up. He is not content merely to rule. He must organize. In the evenings, he reads Plato. In the mornings, he amends the Codex. His library grows. Scrolls become books. Stone becomes wax. Wax becomes parchment. He is no longer a general. He is no longer merely a statesman. He has become the legislator, not in name, but in being. And the Senate? It adjusts. It drafts ceremonial laws. It ratifies Caesar's reforms. It no longer originates legislation, but it adorns it. The senators debate clauses not to amend, but to interpret. The Senate becomes a judicial body, a council of review, an institution of memory. Its glory has passed, but it survives in dignity. There are critics, of course. Some whisper that the Republic is dead. Others fear that the law is now too vast, too intricate, too imperial. A few retire to their villas, muttering of Cato and Cicero, but their voices are lost in the tide. Because for the people, for the millions who live under Rome's flag, life is now safer, more predictable, more navigable. Justice may not be perfect, but it is visible. Bureaucracy may be cumbersome, but it is fair. For the merchant, the widow, the farmer, the veteran, Caesar's law is not tyranny. It is structure. It is peace. And so, with scroll and seal, Caesar completes his greatest conquest. Not of Gaul, not of Britain, not of Parthia, but of Rome itself. He has taken chaos and made it form. He has taken custom and made it code. He has taken power and made it procedure. Caesar the lawgiver does not need temples. His temple is the law. The Senate of Rome, ancient, venerated August, was never merely a legislative body. It was an idea, a ritual, a relic, both sacred and ossified. Born in the midst of Rome's monarchic past and nurtured through centuries of republican rule, the Senate had seen kings fall, dictators rise, and provinces bloom under its jurisdiction. But as Julius Caesar walked away from the Ides of March untouched, As the conspirators never drew their blades and the Curia Pompei did not echo with blood, the Senate began its slow, almost imperceptible transformation, not into extinction, but into something quieter, something ceremonial, something imperial. In this Rome without regicide, the Senate continues to meet, continues to deliberate, continues to speak in the sonorous tones of Cicero's language. The marble benches are still polished, the togas still drape, the ring of lictors still surrounds the consuls. But their voices now echo with a different timbre, one not of command, but of commentary. For Caesar, still careful in appearance, if not in structure, never abolishes the Senate. He simply redefines it. At first, it is subtle. The number of senators, once tightly controlled and fiercely guarded, is expanded. In our history, Caesar increased the number to 900. In this extended timeline, the number swells even further. Provincial notables, loyal magistrates, veterans with land and wealth, all are granted seats. The Senate becomes less an exclusive order of Rome's oldest families and more a cross-section of the empire's rising elite. Old senators grumble, new senators celebrate, Latin mixes with Gallic accents, names once unfamiliar, Licinius of Massilia, Drusus of Hispania, Aemilius of Baetica, are heard within the Curia. This dilution is no accident. By flooding the Senate with loyalists, dependents, and provincial voices, Caesar weakens its core while expanding its usefulness. He does not silence the Senate, he drowns it. Over time, the Senate's functions begin to change. Legislation, once a domain of fierce debate and intricate alliances, becomes a process of ratification. Proposals emerge not from within the Senate walls, but from Caesar's office on the Palatine. Senators read the proposals, debate their phrasing, suggest minor amendments, and then pass them unanimously. The illusion of debate is preserved. The reality is that Caesar governs through pre-law. What the Senate passes is already decided. Still, the senators remain busy. They supervise festivals. They oversee temple maintenance. They organize triumphal games. They administer senatorial provinces, those regions still under traditional Roman control, not under direct imperial administration. But even these tasks are performed with Caesar's indirect oversight. Each senator now answers to a praefectus senatus, an office Caesar creates to coordinate senatorial activity and report directly to him. This prefect, always a trusted confidant, functions as Caesar's whisper in the chamber. And what of the consuls? The office of consul, once the pinnacle of republican ambition, still exists. 2 are elected annually, but their power is ceremonial. They preside over Senate meetings, attend religious rites, and speak at funerals. The people cheer them. Their names are recorded in the fasti, but everyone knows where the real authority lies. The consul may carry the fasces, but Caesar carries the will. Indeed, Caesar himself never again takes the consulship after his extended reforms. He holds instead the titles of Dictator Perpetuus, Imperator, and Pontifex Maximus. He governs not by annual mandate, but by perpetual prerogative. And yet, in the public theater of Rome, he refers to the Senate as our most honorable body, always deferential in word, never in practice. As years pass, a quiet resignation settles over the old patrician families. They no longer aspire to power, they aspire to proximity. A word from Caesar is worth more than a decade of senatorial service. Ambitious young men no longer build alliances within the Senate, they seek audiences with the imperial court. The cursus honorum remains intact but hollow. Quaestors are appointed, aediles manage markets, praetors preside over courts, but the weight behind their robes is ceremonial. The Senate still stands, but as a shadow of itself. And yet, it does not disappear. This is Caesar's genius. He understands that institutions, unlike men, must die slowly. To destroy the Senate outright would be to risk rebellion, to court nostalgia, to provoke martyrdom. But to preserve it, to adorn it, to gradually detooth it, this is safer, more elegant, more Roman. And so the Senate becomes a theater. Its debates, once fierce and consequential, are now procedural and harmonious. Its oratory, once weaponized, is now poetic. Its rituals continue. The donning of togas, the opening of sessions with augury, the procession of curule chairs. But like actors on a stage, the senators play roles written elsewhere. There are, to be sure, moments of resistance. Some senators, still burning with Republican zeal, attempt to voice dissent. They quote Cato. They invoke the memory of the Republic. They lament the loss of deliberative freedom. But they are politely ignored. Others find themselves appointed to distant provinces. A few resign their posts. 1 or 2 mysteriously vanish, but there are no purges, no prescriptions, no show trials. Caesar rules not through fear, but through architecture. The Senate remains, beautiful, hollow, intact. Meanwhile, public perception shifts. To the common Roman, the Senate is a pageant, dignified, distant, irrelevant. The people care more for bread, for games, for grain prices, for imperial festivals. They cheer Caesar, not the Senate. They raise statues to the emperor, not to the curule magistrates. In marketplaces and baths, they speak of Caesar's victories, Caesar's laws, Caesar's mercy. The Senate? It is spoken of in the past tense with a tinge of nostalgia, like an old family heirloom, beloved, unused, preserved behind glass. By the 10th year of Caesar's unbroken reign, the Senate functions much like a court of aristocracy in a monarchic state. It is consulted, it is praised, it is richly dressed. But it does not rule. It is no longer the beating heart of Rome. It is a set of lungs, breathing but not speaking. And yet, this transformation is not a death. It is a transmutation. For within the Senate's old shell, a new role begins to form, that of imperial memory. Under Caesar's direction, the Senate begins to keep detailed annals, not of laws, but of imperial events. Births, deaths, omens, harvests, festivals, treaties, all are recorded in the Acta Senatus. The Senate becomes the recorder of the empire, its memory, its archivist. Historians are drawn from senatorial ranks. Philosophers address the chamber on ethics, virtue, and destiny. It becomes a space not of power, but of reflection. Temples are erected to former senators now deified. Busts are installed in the Curia, Cicero, Scipio, even Cato. The Senate becomes a museum to the Republic, tended not by revolutionaries, but by loyal curators. And thus, in surviving Caesar, the Senate survives itself. It ceases to govern, but it endures. It ceases to command, but it testifies. It is no longer the brain of Rome, but it remains its soul. Caesar, ever the strategist, understands the power of continuity. By keeping the Senate, he keeps Rome Roman. The people see white togas, marble halls, and Latin debates. They do not see autocracy. They see tradition, shaped, softened, but still standing. And when, at last, Caesar grows old and the question of succession looms like a Roman twilight over the Palatine, the Senate prepares for a final role, that of witness. It will bless the heir, whoever he may be. It will record his name, praise his virtues, quote his lineage. It will pretend to choose what has already been chosen, and in doing so, it will ensure the empire flows onward, unchallenged, uninterrupted, unbroken. The Senate, once the forge of Rome's destiny, becomes its reliquary. And in that reliquary, beneath the ashes of liberty and the marble of custom, a quiet flame still flickers, not of power, but of presence. For though Caesar rules Rome, it is the Senate that reminds her who she once was. Rome always looked eastward with both desire and dread. There, beyond the Euphrates, lay a civilization older than Rome, richer in silk and sapphire, mysterious in its ways, and indomitable in its cavalry. The Parthian Empire, heir to the Achaemenids and rival to Roman ambition, had humiliated a Roman army not so many years before at Carrhae. There, Crassus, the triumvir, the financier, the braggart, had perished under a hail of arrows, his head stuffed with molten gold. Rome remembered that loss. Caesar remembered it keenly. It was unfinished business. In our world, the Ides of March struck him down before he could embark upon his eastern campaign. But here, in this altered history, he lives. He consolidates power, reforms law, pacifies the Senate, and then, like Alexander before him, turns his gaze toward Asia. The year is 41 BCE. Rome is at peace. The legions are rested, well paid, loyal. The provinces are administered with Roman efficiency. The grain flows. The treasury is full. The political fires have cooled into embers. There is in Caesar's mind no better moment. He begins, not with legions, but with roads. A vast military road is commissioned, stretching from Antioch to the banks of the Euphrates. Forts are raised every 20 Roman miles. Bridges are reinforced. Supply chains are secured. Roman engineers, skilled from years of Gallic construction, are deployed eastward to build a logistical marvel, one capable of moving tens of thousands of men, horses, carts, siege engines, and munitions across deserts and mountains. Where water is scarce, aqueducts are improvised. Where terrain resists, it is carved. Caesar does not march into Parthia unprepared. Then come the legions. From the Rhine, from Illyria, from Gaul, veterans are summoned. Fresh recruits from Hispania and North Africa swell their ranks. Altogether, over 20 legions are assembled, more than 100,000 soldiers, including auxiliaries, engineers, archers from Crete, slingers from the Balearics, and horsemen from Numidia and Thrace. It is the largest mobilization since the wars against Hannibal. At the head of this force, not merely as commander, but as embodiment of Rome's destiny, rides Caesar. But unlike other campaigns, this one is not framed as conquest. Caesar's proclamation, read in every forum and square from Rome to Alexandria, declares it a campaign of justice. The Parthians must answer for Carrhae. The eagles lost under Crassus must be recovered. The honor of Rome must be restored. And thus the Eastern campaign begins, not with invasion, but with symbolism. In spring of 40 BCE, Caesar crosses the Euphrates. The Parthians are not unaware. King Orodes II, aging but shrewd, recalls how Rome wages war. He knows Caesar is not Crassus. He prepares accordingly. Cities in Mesopotamia are fortified, garrisons are increased, spies are dispatched. But the Parthians make a strategic error. They underestimate Caesar's ability to adapt. The Roman army does not march as Crassus had, in columns, unshielded across open desert. It advances in staggered formations, flanked by cavalry, shielded by scouts. Supply depots are pre-established. Water is rationed with discipline. Skirmishes erupt, but Rome holds firm. For each ambush, Caesar responds not with blind pursuit, but with entrapment. The Romans dig in, fortify camps, establish patrols. They do not chase shadows, they make the shadows come to them. Caesar then employs a tactic borrowed from the Parthians themselves, mobility. His cavalry, reinforced by horse archers from Armenia and local allies, are retrained in Eastern tactics. The Roman army evolves. It no longer relies solely on heavy infantry. It becomes hybrid, elastic, strategic. City by city, Mesopotamia falls, not in great sieges, but in negotiated surrenders. Caesar offers leniency, protection, even self-governance in exchange for loyalty. Babylon opens its gates. Seleucia resists, but only briefly. The cities of the Tigris region, weary of Parthian taxation and internal dissent, welcome the order of Rome. By late 40th BCE, Caesar has reached Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. It is not taken easily. The siege lasts 6 months. The city is defended by Parthian cataphracts and hardened archers. But Caesar, ever patient, employs both engineering and psychology. Siege towers rise, tunnels are dug. Roman engineers, trained in the mining of Gallic forts, exploit weaknesses in the city's outer walls. Then, as winter approaches, Caesar offers terms, not of destruction, but of coexistence. The gates open, a treaty is signed. Rome does not annex Parthia. It does something more cunning. Caesar recognizes a rival claimant to the Parthian throne, Tiridates, a prince in exile, willing to rule under Roman auspices. Orodes II is deposed with minimal bloodshed. In his place stands a Roman client king, loyal, decorated, and forever grateful. Parthia becomes what Egypt already is, a sovereign facade, beneath which Rome moves freely. And then comes the gesture that cements the myth. In the central plaza of Ctesiphon, beneath banners bearing the eagle and SPQR, Caesar receives the lost standards of Crassus. They are returned, not seized. A ritual of forgiveness, a theater of redemption. Rome's honor, once buried beneath Parthian arrows, is restored, not through vengeance, but through spectacle. The legions do not remain. Caesar, ever cautious of overextension, withdraws most of his forces after the settlement. Garrisons are left in key cities, roads are maintained. But the campaign ends with diplomacy, not occupation. The East, unconquered in body, is conquered in spirit. And back in Rome, the effects are seismic. Temples are built in Caesar's honor. Coins are minted bearing his image with inscriptions proclaiming Redemptor Orientis, Redeemer of the East. Historians write of his campaign as the final act of Rome's ascendancy, not over land, but over time. The Senate, ever ceremonial, passes a resolution declaring the Eastern standards recovered to be sacred relics of the Republic. Statues of Caesar bearing the eagles are placed in every provincial capital. Caesar does not overplay his triumph. He does not declare himself king. He does not demand a crown. Instead, he stages a grand triumph in Rome, modest in tone but grand in scale. The spoils of the East, textiles, perfumes, exotic animals, silks, are paraded alongside the soldiers who brought them home. But it is not the treasures that impress. It is the fact that Rome has finally stood face to face with its eastern rival and prevailed. More quietly, more profoundly, trade routes begin to shift. Roman merchants, emboldened by the new alliance, travel deeper into Asia. Goods flow more steadily along the Silk Road. Eastern influences begin to appear in Roman art, architecture, and fashion. Parthian bows are studied by Roman fletchers. Eastern spices appear in Roman kitchens. Philosophers debate the meanings of Zoroastrian thought. A synthesis begins, not yet cultural fusion, but awareness. The Eastern campaign also brings something unexpected, humility. Caesar, now entering the later stages of his life, speaks often of Alexander the Great, but he speaks not of glory, but of burden. He tells his advisors that conquest is not victory, it is responsibility. He writes a treatise, De Moderatione Imperii, on the moderation of empire, arguing that Rome must not seek to dominate the world, but to stabilize it. This idea will form the bedrock of post-Caesarian ideology. Future emperors, educated in Caesar's law schools, will study not only his conquests, but his restraint. Expansion slows, consolidation begins. Rome ceases to be a devouring flame and becomes instead a hearth, burning steadily, illuminating the world, but consuming less. And in Parthia, the consequences are lasting. Though nominally independent, the empire becomes thoroughly Romanized in court etiquette, administration, and commerce. Latin is spoken at court. Roman architects design temples and forums. Caesar's name is engraved in Parthian inscriptions. For a century or more, the East and West are bound not by war, but by Caesar's compromise. In time, the Parthian-Roman frontier is stabilized. No longer a line of conflict, it becomes a membrane of exchange. Soldiers guard, but also intermarry. Governors report, but also listen. The Euphrates, once a barrier, becomes a bridge. And thus, the greatest campaign of Caesar's life does not end in annihilation, nor in annexation, but in equilibrium. The East is not made Roman, but it bows, briefly, to Caesar. In the annals of history, few names conjure as much intrigue, sensuality, and political acumen as Cleopatra VII Philopator, last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty. In the conventional march of time, her fate intertwines tragically with that of Mark Antony, ending in romanticized despair upon the arrival of Octavian. But in this altered chronology, in a Rome where Caesar never fell beneath the knives of March, Cleopatra's story unfolds not as an epilogue of empire, but as a chapter of transformation. Here she does not die in shadow, but rises in radiance, ascending not merely as Queen of Egypt, but as a consort in all but name to the greatest Roman of the age. Following Caesar's eastern campaign, as victory banners flutter in Parthia and Roman standards are restored to glory, the conqueror returns not first to Rome, but to Alexandria. It is not a detour, it is a declaration. The political symbolism is immense. The most powerful man in the Roman world chooses to enter the Mediterranean through its intellectual and cultural crown, Alexandria, where the queen awaits, not merely as a foreign sovereign, but as a political equal. Cleopatra, ever perceptive, understands the gravity of Caesar's return. No mere triumph or dalliance awaits her. This is a moment of global recalibration. She welcomes him not in private chambers, but in ceremonial procession. Gold canopies, silk-draped barges, incense curling into the air, an orchestration designed not to seduce, but to signal parity. The two had already borne a child, Caesarion, or Ptolemy XV, born during the earlier phase of their entanglement. In our reality, he was but a footnote. In this alternate Rome, he becomes the living embodiment of two worlds unified. Rome and Egypt, West and East, steel and gold. In Alexandria, the couple confers not merely as lovers, but as rulers. Cleopatra presents her vision. An Egypt restored to strength, administratively reformed, economically tied to Roman trade, and religiously cooperative with Roman institutions. She offers Egypt as a loyal client, not in humiliation, but in harmony. Caesar listens. He, too, understands legacy. Not only military legacy, not only political, but dynastic. With no legitimate Roman wife and no sons born in Italy, Caesar now reconsiders the structure of succession, not as a private affair, but as a trans-imperial reality. The implications are radical. To the Roman mind, the very idea of merging with a foreign monarchy, especially one steeped in Hellenistic and pharaonic tradition, pushes the boundaries of Romanitas. Yet Caesar, ever pragmatic, ever ahead of his time, begins to reshape public perception. First come the intellectual overtures. In Rome, philosophical treatises begin to circulate, commissioned by Caesar himself, drawing parallels between Roman virtues and Egyptian mot, between the Stoic concept of logos and the Egyptian notion of divine order. Scholars from Alexandria are invited to lecture in Roman academies. Senators, initially skeptical, are honored with Egyptian gifts and titles. Egypt is not framed as exotic. It is framed as ancient wisdom, merely rediscovered by Rome. Then, political elevation follows. Cleopatra is invited to Rome, this time not as a private guest, nor as a whispered presence on the Palatine, but as an honored monarch. Her arrival is choreographed with all the pomp afforded to foreign royalty. Triumphal arches, public games, ceremonial feasts. Caesar publicly walks beside her. He names her Regina et Consort Imperi, queen and consort of the empire. It is not a marriage, not in legal terms. Roman law does not permit it, but it is a union in every political sense. The Roman people, initially bewildered, gradually acquiesce. They see that Caesar grows no weaker with her presence, but stronger. Egyptian grain stabilizes the food supply. Egyptian ships patrol the eastern Mediterranean under Roman command. Cleopatra sponsors public works, libraries, schools of medicine, and astronomy. She becomes not merely an ornament of the regime, but a partner in its civilizing mission. The Senate, though murmuring, does not oppose. It cannot. For by this time, Caesar's authority is so entrenched, so baked into the marrow of the republic's remaining bones, that resistance has become performance, and in their performance, the senators applaud. They do more. At Caesar's suggestion, carefully, incrementally, they pass the Lex Julia Orientalis, a law recognizing the children of Roman men and foreign queens as having special legal status. It is a calculated step. It does not name Caesarion directly, but all know whom it benefits. The path is being laid. Cleopatra returns to Alexandria, but not in departure. She goes to govern, with Roman oversight, yes, but also Roman legitimacy. Caesarion, now still a child, is raised in both traditions. He learns Latin and Greek. He studies Caesar's commentaries and Homer's epics. He is tutored in Roman martial discipline and Egyptian priestly ritual. A boy who walks in both worlds, whose gaze stretches from the Nile to the Tiber. The synthesis ripples outward. Roman women begin to emulate Cleopatra's courtly fashion. Fine linens, elaborate coiffures, subtle cosmetics. Egyptian astronomers influence Roman calendars. The Julian calendar itself, rooted in Egyptian solar observations, becomes not just an administrative reform, but a symbol of Caesar's blended vision. Of course, not all accept this easily. There are murmurs of Eastern decadence. Old patricians fret about foreign gods and women in politics. Some whisper that Cleopatra seeks to enthrone herself in Rome, that she is a second Dido, a Carthaginian queen in disguise. Pamphlets circulate, poets mock. Caesar responds not with censorship, but with symbolism. He constructs a great monument on the Capitoline Hill, a temple of Concordia Imperii, harmony of the empires. Its architecture is Greco-Roman in structure, Egyptian in ornamentation. Statues within depict not only Roman gods, but Isis alongside Minerva, Osiris beside Mars. The message is clear. Rome does not surrender to the East. It absorbs it. It shapes it. In private, however, Caesar remains cautious. He knows that naming Caesarion as heir outright would ignite old fires. The Roman nobility, even cowed, retains pride. The idea of a half-Egyptian boy on the Roman throne, however ceremonial that throne has become, is still a bitter taste. So Caesar delays. He names no successor, but grooms Caesarion as Princeps Juventutis, first of the youth, a title that signals promise without provocation. He builds a gradual myth around the boy, wise beyond his years, fluent in statecraft, destined for leadership. And Cleopatra, now in her 30s, flourishes as no other queen of Egypt has in generations. She modernizes the bureaucracy, curbs corruption, reforms the temple system, and funds expeditions into Nubia and Arabia. Egypt, under her dual rule, becomes not a fading kingdom, but a rejuvenated partner in a Mediterranean order defined not by conquest, but by coordination. She returns to Rome annually. Her presence becomes institutional, expected, even celebrated. Festivals are held in her honor. Her portrait appears on coins alongside Caesar's. Temples to Isis expand across the Roman world, not as competition to Jupiter or Mars, but as complements. Syncretism becomes policy. And through all this, a quiet revolution brews. For the first time in Roman memory, a woman, foreign, articulate, autonomous, operates not as puppet or intrigue, but as partner in empire. Cleopatra becomes a model not just for queens, but for the very possibility of female political agency within the Roman world. Women of the elite class begin to press their husbands for more influence. Matrons fund libraries. Widows sponsor public baths. The idea of feminine power, once confined to the domestic, begins, tentatively, delicately, to enter the civic sphere, all under Caesar's watchful guidance. He does not destroy Rome's patriarchy. He does not even challenge it overtly. But by elevating Cleopatra, by normalizing her presence, he plants seeds that will sprout in generations to come. Even in death, which draws near as he ages past 60, Caesar leaves the matter unresolved. He dies, not from violence, but from age, illness, fatigue. And when he does, the world turns to Cleopatra, not for rule, but for continuity. She is not regent, she is not Roman empress, but she is mother of the bridge between worlds. And Caesarion? He ascends not to total power, but to symbolic prominence. Under a carefully balanced system of triumvirs and senatorial oversight, Caesarion becomes a co-consul, then an imperator designatus, not emperor, but princeps, not autocrat, but symbol. And Cleopatra, watching from Alexandria, knows her work is done. She, who once feared Roman invasion, has instead invaded Rome, not with legions, but with lineage, not with fire, but with presence. She becomes not the last queen of Egypt, but the first queen of Rome. Beneath the great vaulted ceilings of the Basilica Julia, where the air was heavy with incense and dust from passing sandals, scrolls rustled like distant whispers of the gods. Here, among clerks, tribunes, magistrates, and notaries, Julius Caesar began to undertake what would become one of his most enduring and overlooked achievements. Not military, not architectural, not political in the visible sense, but legal. He would, in the decades following his escape from death, become not merely dictator or father of the state, but the silent sculptor of jurisprudence. Roman law, by the time of Caesar's rise, was both revered and chaotic. The 12 tables, etched in bronze centuries before, still formed the moral foundation, but the law itself had grown gnarled, corrupted by patchwork edicts, partisan interpretations, and inconsistent enforcement across provinces. The Senate issued senatus consulta, the tribunes passed plebiscita, consuls interpreted the jus gentium, and praetors issued edicts that reshaped justice annually. It was, to use Caesar's own words in a lost letter, a sacred tangle of wisdom and convenience. Had Caesar died in 44 BCE, as in our timeline, this tangle would persist into the Augustan era, where his grandnephew would begin, but never complete, a modest legal reorganization. But in this altered reality, Caesar, alive and unopposed, sets about codifying the law not as a ruler seeking order, but as an architect imagining eternity. The project begins not with sweeping announcements, but with observation. Caesar commissions jurists from across the Republic and its provinces, men of learning from Hispania, Africa, Asia, and Gaul, to submit summaries of local legal customs. He convenes a rotating concilium juris in Rome, a body of scholars and magistrates who, for months at a time, study contradictions, compare precedents, and draft initial frameworks. This early group includes names later lost to history: Sextus Gellius of Narbo, Manius Etruscus of Carthage, Lucius Aelius from Syracuse, men whose knowledge of regional adaptation becomes vital to Caesar's goal. And what precisely is that goal? It is not mere harmonization nor homogenization. Caesar, acutely aware of Rome's cultural diversity, does not wish to erase difference. Rather, he seeks clarity, predictability, a system in which a farmer in Numidia, a merchant in Massilia, and a soldier in Dalmatia all understand their obligations and protections under the Roman order. For Caesar, law must do more than punish, it must unify. Thus is born the concept of the corpus juris Caesarium, or Caesar's body of law. It is not a single scroll or tablet. It is a series of codices, each addressing a key domain. Codex Civicus, the rights and duties of Roman citizens. Codex Provincialis, the special statutes and local adaptations for provincial populations. Codex Militaris, regulations governing the Roman army, discipline, pensions, and military justice. Codex Familia et Patriae, the intricate laws of inheritance, marriage, manumission, and property. Codex Mercatorum, commercial law, contracts, maritime trade, taxation. Each codex is drafted, reviewed, amended, and then issued with commentary. Caesar does not simply promulgate, he annotates. His marginalia, preserved in later manuscripts, offer insights into his reasoning, his desire to balance tradition with pragmatism, precedent with utility. For example, in a note attached to Codex Familia, he remarks, "A father's power must yield to the good of the house, lest the domus become a tyranny of age and custom." It is a quiet revolution. He is redefining patria potestas, the father's authority, not by abolishing it, but by subjecting it to the higher principle of domestic harmony. Sons may now appeal to magistrates for unjust treatment. Wives may hold property in their own name under specific conditions. Freedmen gain clearer paths to citizenship. These changes are introduced slowly, predictably, and always with careful ritual to mask their radical nature. Caesar, the consummate politician, couches each reform in the language of tradition. New courts are inaugurated with ceremonies invoking Romulus and Numa. Statues of the 12 tables are erected beside newer inscriptions, physically demonstrating continuity. And when protests arise, Caesar listens and then expands his commentary, never retracting the law, but clarifying its rationale. In time, the legal revolution becomes the silent engine of empire. In the provinces, disputes once escalated to violence now proceed to adjudication. Governors find their power checked, not by foreign resistance, but by reference to Caesar's law. A dispute over grain tariffs in Sicilia is resolved not by bribes or threats, but by citing Codex Mercatorum, Section 7, Subclause 14. In Asia Minor, freedmen establish councils to protect their new rights. In Gaul, magistrates trained in Roman law begin to resolve tribal inheritance disputes, using the new codices, drawing legitimacy from Rome without coercion. Even in Rome, the effects are transformative. Litigation becomes less theatrical, more procedural. The centumviral court, once a stage for rhetorical excess, now resembles a rational tribunal. Records are standardized, penalties are codified. Praetors, no longer issuing their own edicts, now interpret Caesar's statutes. And as the law becomes legible, so too does power. No longer cloaked in senatorial privilege or patrician exception, Caesar's government begins to appear as a meritocratic system, predictable, structured, governed not by whim, but by principle. It is, of course, an illusion. Power still flows from Caesar. The law is his creation. But because it is cloaked in clarity, it becomes irresistible. Foreign powers take note. Envoys from Parthia and Armenia request Latin translations of the codices. The king of Mauritania sends his son to study Roman law in Carthage. Even Hellenistic cities, once proud of their own legal traditions, begin to adopt Caesar's principles for local matters. Caesar does not need conquest. His law conquers for him. Within 2 decades of the corpus's inception, law schools are founded in key provincial cities: Massilia, Corduba, Antioch, Carthago Nova. A new class of professionals emerges, the juris periti, or experts of the law. These men travel with governors, advise magistrates, write commentaries, and in time wield soft power equal to that of any legionary commander. It is important to note that Caesar does not abolish the Senate, nor erase older Roman institutions. They persist, like organs in a body whose function has changed. The Senate becomes a forum for high-level legal discourse, offering amendments and scholarly interpretations of Caesar's codes. The tribunate becomes a mechanism for petition, allowing the plebs to propose legal revisions under Caesar's benevolent supervision. And the consuls? They remain ceremonial, presiding over legal festivals, ensuring that the year begins with public oaths to uphold the corpus. No longer rivals for real power, they are the robed heralds of the legal order, respected, even beloved, but politically neutered. One must pause to consider what this legal transformation means for the idea of Roman identity. Previously, to be Roman was to be born Roman, to be descended from ancestors who had served the Republic. Now, under Caesar's law, Romanitas becomes something else. It becomes a status achieved, a relationship formalized, a legal identity that can be granted, recorded, transmitted. The barriers of blood and tradition soften. The empire becomes not merely a territory, but a framework, a legal reality to which one may subscribe, adhere, belong. And in this new reality, Caesar becomes more than a man. He becomes the font of order. His name is invoked in courts. By the spirit of Caesar, let justice be done. His statutes are etched into city walls beside the names of consuls. His words are memorized by students from Alexandria to Londinium. He becomes the embodiment of lex, not merely law as rule, but law as reason. And when he dies, as all men must, his body is burned with imperial rites, but his corpus remains. The corpus juris Caesarium is placed in a sealed vault beneath the temple of Concordia Imperii. Copies are distributed to every provincial capital. His successors do not dare alter it. They append, revise, interpret, but the original remains sacred. Caesar is gone, but the law remains. In this alternate Rome, the Republic did not fall in one day, nor in blood. It faded into structure. It crystallized into code, and through this code, Caesar ruled even after death, not as dictator perpetuo, but as legis conditor aeternus, eternal lawgiver. In the year 47 BCE, amid the glittering opulence of Alexandria's royal palace, nestled beside the great harbor, where the sea whispered against the stone quays, a child was born whose existence would quietly alter the axis of 2 worlds. To the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra sent. Philopator, he was the heir to a divine dynasty, a living proof of her liaison with the most powerful man of the West. To Julius Caesar, he was both possibility and peril, a bridge between empires and an heir born of foreign gods. They named him Ptolemaeus, 15th, Philopator, Philometor Caesar, known in the streets and scrolls simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. In our historical timeline, Caesarion would live a brief and tragic life, executed on the order of Octavian following Cleopatra's defeat. But in this altered timeline, one in which the daggers of March never fell, and Caesar rules long into stability, the boy does not fade into obscurity. He rises, slowly, deliberately, as if Rome itself had been holding its breath, waiting. Julius Caesar does not publicly name Caesarion as his heir, not at first. The political atmosphere of Rome remains brittle in the years following Caesar's assumption of perpetual dictatorship. Despite Caesar's consolidation of power, despite the Senate's gradual deference and the people's adoration, the notion of hereditary monarchy still clings to the Roman consciousness like a specter of tyranny. Kings were banished from Rome's identity. The word rex is still anathema. And so, Caesar proceeds with caution, even with regard to blood. In the early years of Caesarion's life, the child remains in Alexandria, raised within the layered traditions of the Ptolemaic court. Tutors instruct him in Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. He studies mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. Cleopatra, herself a polyglot and scholar of the highest order, oversees his education with meticulous devotion. She instructs him in the cult of Isis, the lineage of the Macedonian kings, and the sacred rituals of the Nile. But also, she ensures that he recites Virgil and Lucretius, learns Roman law, and understands the virtues of gravitas, pietas, and dignitas, values Roman and royal alike. By the age of 10, Caesarion speaks with the composed seriousness of a senator and the grace of a priest. Rumors swirl across the Mediterranean that Caesar has a son, that the child is beautiful, gifted, and destined for more than Egypt. But nothing is confirmed. Officially, Caesar remains fatherless. Rome holds its breath. It is not until Caesarion is brought to Rome, quietly, ceremonially, without heralds, that the course begins to change. The year is 35 BCE. Julius Caesar is 71 years old. He has outlived his rivals, restructured the state, codified the law, expanded the empire eastward, and seen the rise of a generation born into his reign. His succession must be considered. Octavian, once his grandnephew and adopted son in the other timeline, remains loyal but secondary. Marcus Agrippa, though brilliant, is a general, not a successor. Mark Antony, never alienated from Caesar, now governs the eastern provinces in harmony with Rome and does not challenge Caesar's domestic plans. Caesarion, now aged 12, arrives as a student, not as an heir, but Rome notices. He is brought not to the Palatine, but to the Domus Publica, and enrolled in the Collegium Juventutis, a school reserved for the sons of nobility. He walks through the forum with a modest escort. He attends Senate sessions in silence. He dines beside senators, judges, philosophers. He learns the layout of the tabularium, the sacred geometry of the Pantheon, and the words of Cicero preserved in marble. Caesar does not speak of succession, but he watches. The boy learns to observe as well. Over the next 5 years, Caesarion disappears from the public imagination but grows in private stature. He serves as a junior magistrate in Hispania. He accompanies a delegation to Mauritania. He writes essays on Roman history and Hellenic theology. He is a child of two worlds, equally at ease in a Roman toga or an Egyptian diadem. When he turns 18, Caesar convenes a concilium of senior senators and magistrates. In a speech carefully crafted and delivered not in triumph, but in somber reflection, Caesar announces that the future of Rome must be one of stability and harmony. He introduces Caesarion not as a king, not as a co-ruler, but as Princeps Juventutis, first among the youth. It is a symbolic title, used in Republican tradition for young men of promise, but the implication is unmistakable. From that day onward, Caesarion is never absent from the Acta Senatus. He holds no formal imperium, but he attends every key session. He sits beside his father during judicial reviews. He is appointed curator of the Via Appia, then Pontifex Minor, and later tribunician envoy to the provinces. These are real posts, laden with responsibility and significance. Yet each comes with a careful limit, an invisible line never crossed. Caesar maintains supreme control. What is remarkable and often overlooked by modern historians is how Caesar integrates Caesarion into Roman political life without igniting resentment. The secret lies in balance. Caesar does not displace Roman families. He elevates their sons alongside his own. Agrippa's son, Vipsanius Minor, is appointed co-administrator of Caesarion's first governorship. The Julii, the Antonii, the Aemilii, all are included in the new structure. It is not a dynasty in the monarchic sense, but a meritocracy of blood and service, with Caesarion as its golden thread. Over time, the people of Rome begin to see in Caesarion something more than heritage. He is seen in the public baths, speaking in Latin with the plebeians. He distributes grain during famine, speaks at funerals, recites Virgil at literary festivals. He is less divine than his mother, less martial than his father, but more relatable than both. And yet, beneath this gentle surface, the machinery of succession is grinding forward. At age 24, Caesarion is granted tribunician sacrosanctity, an unofficial form of immunity and voice. It means that no senator may harm or interrupt him. A year later, he is named Praefectus Urbi, chief administrator of Rome itself. When Caesar falls ill at age 78, Rome does not panic. Caesarion is already governing in his stead. Upon Caesar's death, peaceful, ceremonious, mourned with grandeur unlike any seen since Alexander, Caesarion assumes power not through coup or conquest, but through confirmation. The Senate, now an instrument of continuity, ratifies his titles. The people gather in the forum to acclaim him as Caesar Augustus Minor. But he does not take the title king. He does not style himself pharaoh in Rome. He becomes simply Caesarion Augustus, the reverent son. And so, the boy once hidden behind Alexandrian curtains becomes the master of two civilizations. In Egypt, temples celebrate him as divine. In Rome, laws bear his signature. He marries a Roman noblewoman, descendant of the Scipios. He fathers children with names that blend Roman stoicism and Ptolemaic elegance. Lucius Ptolemaeus, Julia Philometora, Tiberius Gnaeus Dionysius. His rule is marked by equilibrium. Under his reign, Egypt remains semi-autonomous but Roman-aligned. Trade flows across the empire without obstruction. Temples in Athens, Carthage, and Jerusalem flourish. Philosophers speak of a new golden age. Historians remark that under Caesarion, the empire becomes not only large but luminous. And through it all, he never claims divinity in Rome. That is left to the temples of Isis and the priests of Memphis. To the Senate and people of Rome, Caesarion remains mortal, exalted but human. When he dies, 4 decades into his rule, he is buried beside his father on the Palatine Hill, beneath a modest mausoleum inscribed with a single line, Here lies the bridge between empires. And indeed, that is what he became. In the marble twilight of Roman history, amid columns gilded by empire and scrolls swollen with decree, there exists a figure whose presence, while often veiled in silks and incense, was as enduring and formidable as any general or magistrate. Cleopatra, 7th Philopator. Born into the waning splendor of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a queen of Greek blood ruling over an Egyptian soul, she would, in this altered history, become not merely consort, not merely mother, but Regina Imperii, the queen of the empire. In the timeline we remember, Cleopatra's life ended in tragedy. Her dream of a Greco-Egyptian empire died with her defeat at Actium and her subsequent suicide. But in the world where Julius Caesar survives the Ides of March, her story unfolds along a different axis, longer, deeper, more subtle. When Caesar escapes death in 44 BCE, Cleopatra remains in Alexandria, cautious yet hopeful. The partnership between her and Caesar, strategic, sensual, and intellectual, is not simply revived but restructured. No longer is she merely a queen in need of Roman protection. She becomes a diplomatic partner, the sovereign of a client kingdom whose influence stretches far beyond the Nile. Julius Caesar, in his wisdom, does not bring her to Rome as queen. The Romans, still uneasy about monarchy and wary of the East, would recoil. Instead, she is positioned as protector of Eastern harmony, a formal but indirect role bestowed upon her by decree of the Senate, with carefully chosen language to imply reverence without subordination. She is not Regina Consors, a queen beside the ruler, but Regina Socia, a queen in alliance. Cleopatra returns to Alexandria with legitimacy, Roman recognition, and an unspoken pact. She is to rule Egypt not merely for herself or her dynasty, but for the greater equilibrium of the Mediterranean. She takes this charge seriously. Her reforms in Egypt, long studied and debated by modern scholars, become more than local policy. She restructures the grain fleet, ensuring priority shipments to Roman ports during famine years. She revises the temple tax system, aligning religious institutions with Roman legal expectations. She promotes bilingual education, Greek and Latin, within Alexandria's great museum, ensuring that future scholars can navigate the legal and philosophical frameworks of both empires. And above all, she invests in diplomacy. Cleopatra sends embassies to Judea, Cappadocia, and Armenia. She hosts delegations from Parthia with quiet magnificence, offering them not tribute, but translation, of Rome's intent, of Caesar's policies, of a world where war is no longer the first argument of empire. Her court becomes a node of influence. Roman senators, on travels eastward, pause in Alexandria to seek her counsel. Egyptian engineers are seconded to Roman aqueduct projects. Philosophers from Cyrene, Rhodes, and Ephesus gather in her salons to debate Stoicism and Epicureanism beneath mosaics of Isis and Minerva. Through it all, Cleopatra reigns not with splendor alone, but with strategy. She retains her Egyptian titles, daughter of Ra, living Isis, lady of the two lands, for the sake of native legitimacy. Yet she writes personal correspondence to Caesar in Latin. She commissions busts of herself in both Greek and Roman styles. Her coins bear dual inscriptions. She walks between worlds. The Roman people, once suspicious, grow intrigued. Tales of Cleopatra's intellect circulate in the tabernae and fora, her memory for names, her ability to quote Homer and Cato in the same sentence, her policy of disguising herself to attend public ceremonies in the streets of Alexandria. She is no longer merely an Eastern queen with exotic charm. She is a political figure of real substance. When Caesarion is brought to Rome for his education, it is Cleopatra who designs his curriculum. She insists that he study not only Roman history, but Ptolemaic science, Alexandrian mathematics, Egyptian theology. She ensures he corresponds weekly with her in both Latin and Greek. Her hand is subtle but steady. She shapes the heir to the empire with the patience of a priestess and the foresight of a philosopher. As Caesar ages, Cleopatra's position only strengthens. He does not marry her formally, Roman custom forbids it, but her role is effectively that of empress in all but title. When Caesar travels eastward in 32 BCE to oversee the integration of new provinces, he spends 3 months in Alexandria, during which the city hosts the Convocatio Harmonium, a great summit of provincial governors and eastern monarchs. Cleopatra, robed in white linen and crowned with a vulture diadem, presides beside him. At this summit, agreements are reached that reshape the administrative geography of the Roman world. Egypt is declared permanens regnum sociatum, a permanent allied kingdom, granted autonomous governance under Cleopatra's lineage, with tribute fixed and rights guaranteed. The Judean kingdom is confirmed as a hereditary client state. Cappadocia and Armenia receive semi-federal status, allowed to administer internal law in exchange for allegiance to the Corpus Juris Caesarium. Cleopatra is the linchpin of this arrangement. Her influence, though never proclaimed with fanfare, becomes an essential mechanism of stability. She is the trusted intermediary between Rome and the East. No letter from Parthia is answered without her annotation. No appointment to the eastern provinces is made without consulting her court. And as Caesarion ascends, first in promise, then in power, Cleopatra transitions into a new role, matriarch of an imperial house. Her palace in Alexandria becomes a center of imperial culture. Architects, scribes, and artists travel there from all corners of the empire. Frescoes depict the fusion of Roman eagles and Egyptian lotuses. Libraries expand, cataloging both Cicero and Akhenaten. The Temple of Serapis is rebuilt with Roman columns and Greek inscriptions. Even the calendar shifts. When Caesar introduces the Julian calendar across the empire, Cleopatra ensures that its Egyptian adaptation, the Alexandrian calendar, is harmonized. Festivals align. Eclipses are predicted with stunning accuracy. Time itself, like territory and trade, is synchronized under her subtle guidance. Cleopatra lives to the age of 64, a remarkable longevity for the era. She dies not by her own hand, but in peace, surrounded by scribes and family beneath the carved stars of her private mausoleum in Alexandria. Her body is embalmed according to Egyptian rites and laid to rest beside a statue of Isis holding a Roman scroll. But her legacy does not end in marble. She is deified by popular acclamation in Egypt and commemorated in Rome with a bronze relief along the forum's eastern colonnade, one that bears no crown, but a simple laurel and the inscription, "To Cleopatra, Queen of Peace, Mother of Order." Her children continue her work. Caesarion governs as Augustus. Her daughter Julia Philometora becomes High Priestess of Isis Capitolia in Rome, blending Eastern mysticism with Roman ritual. The dynasty she leaves behind is not Ptolemaic nor Julian, but hybrid, a living symbol of harmony between empire and identity. And thus, Cleopatra, often remembered for her beauty or for her tragedy, in this timeline becomes something far more enduring. She becomes the engine of imperial diplomacy. She becomes the mediator of cultures. She becomes the quiet architect of peace. And in the annals of the Historia Imperii Aeterni, her name appears not as a footnote, but as a chapter heading. In the long corridors of imperial time, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Senate chambers and the domes of eastern sanctuaries, there exists a span of decades so unusually serene, so punctuated by prosperity and order, that later historians would speak of it not merely as an era, but as a phenomenon. It would be called Pax Caesarea, the peace of Caesar. Not unlike the more famous Pax Romana that emerged under Augustus in our own timeline, the Pax Caesarea represented more than an absence of war. It was a deliberate orchestration of calm, a cultivated ecosystem of laws, alliances, infrastructure, and ideology. It did not come by accident, nor by the triumph of arms alone. It was, in a sense, Julius Caesar's final and most enduring conquest, not of territory, but of time itself. The foundation of the Pax Caesarea lay in an early understanding by Caesar and his closest advisors that empire, to endure, must become system and not simply possession. The provinces could not merely be administered, they had to be integrated. The peoples of the Mediterranean could not be subdued, they had to be co-opted. In short, Rome had to cease being the center that ruled the periphery and become the heart that nourished the body. To that end, the first decades following Caesar's consolidation of power were dedicated not to expansion, but to standardization. The process was methodical, almost hypnotically so. Every province was surveyed with astonishing thoroughness. Censuses were conducted with both Roman and local officials, ensuring accuracy while maintaining dignity. Roads were classified, paved, and posted with stone markers in Latin and local dialects. A unified postal system, the Cursus Publicus Caesarensis, was established, operating under strict schedules, with stations spaced a day's ride apart. No less than 3,000 way stations were built within 2 decades. Coinage was likewise unified. Though local mints remained operational, all silver and gold coinage bore the image of Caesar not as a god or monarch, but as a magistrate, Pontifex Maximus, Imperator, Pater Patriae. The inscription varied by province, but the weight and purity did not. This standardization created a trust economy unprecedented in the ancient world. Law followed coin. The Corpus Juris Caesarium, or Caesar's legal corpus, was codified between 35 and 30 BCE. Drawing on both Roman statutory law and customary local practices, it created a flexible but coherent judicial framework. Provincial courts were empowered to administer justice autonomously, provided that rulings could be reconciled with the overarching corpus. The Senate's decreta were binding, but regional interpretation was permitted. This approach was radical for its time. It allowed for variation without fragmentation. A merchant in Antioch could appeal a ruling in the local court directly to Rome. A Greek in Cyrene could sue a Roman soldier using Egyptian notarial protocols. A widow in Judea could petition for inheritance through both Roman and ancestral law, with an imperial adjudicator trained in both. To manage this legal plurality, Caesar founded the Ludus Juris Provincialis, a school of provincial law in Alexandria that would, by 20 BCE, become the most respected legal institution in the empire, second only to Rome's own Collegium Juris. Yet law and coin were but the scaffolding of the Pax Caesarea. The true substance of the peace lay in cultural transformation. Caesar and Cleopatra, through their carefully coordinated policies, cultivated an ideological unity that transcended ethnicity, language, and religious difference. At the heart of this unity was the concept of concordia imperii, the harmony of the empire. It was taught in schools, recited in public ceremonies, engraved in temples and basilicas. It emphasized not Roman supremacy, but Roman synthesis, a model in which each province contributed its own genius to the collective greatness. In Gaul, Celtic traditions were preserved alongside Roman architecture, Druidic festivals were permitted under local supervision, and Gallic nobility were educated in Latin rhetoric. In Hispania, native legal forms were recognized in marriage contracts and land deeds. In the eastern provinces, temple rituals continued unabated, provided they acknowledged Caesar and Rome in their offerings. The result was not uniformity, but polyphonic unity. Like a mosaic, the empire was a singular image composed of many distinct stones. This harmony enabled the great educational flowering of the mid-1st century BCE. Imperial patronage under Caesar, and later Caesarion, saw the expansion of academies in Ephesus, Antioch, Carthage, and even Massilia, modern Marseille. The Library of Alexandria, long diminished by internal strife, was rebuilt and expanded to house over 700,000 scrolls. A parallel archive was established in Pergamon. Knowledge flowed as freely as grain. Philosophers traveled freely. Lectures in Athens blended Stoicism and Egyptian theology. Roman architects studied Ptolemaic geometry to design more resilient aqueducts. Jewish scribes debated Roman jurists in Alexandria's courts, while Latin poets wrote verses inspired by the hieroglyphs of the Nile. Yet perhaps the most visible fruit of the Pax Caesarea was infrastructure. The great roads of this era, Via Nova Caesarea, Via Aegyptiaca, Via Harmoniae, connected far-flung regions in ways previously unimaginable. What once took weeks could be done in days. Grain, olive oil, wool, papyrus, scrolls, letters, all moved under imperial seals with unrivaled efficiency. Port cities flourished. Brundisium, Alexandria, Carthago Nova, and Ephesus became hubs of maritime activity, linked by standardized harbors with Roman Egyptian cranes and imperial inspection posts. Lighthouses were rebuilt along Hellenistic models, most famously the Pharos of Caesarion, a hybrid design that replaced the original Alexandrian structure lost to time. It was during this golden stretch between 30 and 10 BCE that the term the world within came into common use. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and scholars spoke not of going abroad, but of moving within the world, intra orbum. The empire, once imagined as a center projecting outwards, was now understood as a sphere enclosing the known world. Rome no longer dominated the periphery, it contained it. Of course, such peace did not come without challenges. There were murmurs of rebellion in Illyricum, tensions in Judea, and piracy in the Aegean. But the scale of disturbance was minimal compared to previous centuries. More importantly, the response mechanisms were swift and precise. Caesar had restructured the legions not as occupying armies, but as regional stabilizers. Each province maintained a garrison trained in local language and law, led by a commander answerable to both Rome and Alexandria. These legions were not merely soldiers, they were engineers, translators, magistrates. In many ways, they resembled mobile administrative corps, enforcing the pax not through fear, but through presence. And underpinning all of this, economy, law, culture, infrastructure, was a deepening imperial identity. The concept of civis imperii, citizen of the empire, began to eclipse older distinctions of Roman versus provincial. It became common for inscriptions to read Marcus of Thapsus, citizen of the empire, or Selene of Alexandria, daughter of the Orbis. The notion that one's loyalty and belonging were defined by cultural participation, not ancestry, marked a profound shift in human civilization. The impact of the Pax Caesarea on population growth, urbanization, and literacy is difficult to overstate. Towns blossomed into cities. Cities became capitals. Local dialects were preserved, but Latin and Greek served as linguae francae for trade and governance. Literacy expanded beyond the aristocracy. By 10 BCE, it is estimated that nearly 20% of the empire's population had basic reading skills, an astonishing figure for the time. And amid all this, Caesarion ruled not with an iron scepter, but with a stylus. His reign, modeled on his father's principles and his mother's vision, ensured that the Pax Caesarea was not simply an interlude, but a foundation. A new order had emerged, not born of fire, but of deliberation. And when, in the quiet year of 8th BCE, an eclipse passed over the Mediterranean, priests from Rome, Alexandria, and Jerusalem gathered at the Temple of Harmony on the island of Delos. There they declared the eclipse not an omen of doom, but of unity. A new calendar was unveiled, Annus Concordiae, the year of Concord, marking year zero not from the founding of Rome nor the reign of Caesar, but from the formal beginning of peace. The world had changed, not by accident nor by miracle, but by design. And thus, in the slow breath of empire, in the steady march of postal couriers, in the silent turning of scrolls, the Pax Caesarea endured. Beyond the smooth curvature of Roman roads, past the harmonious provinces of the Aegean and the placid waters of the Levant, there lies a borderland not drawn by ink upon parchment, but by memory, ambition, and myth. It is the eastern frontier, the ever-shifting boundary between the world of Rome and the world of Parthia. In the reality we know, this border was defined by war, by the bitter defeat of Crassus at Carrhae, and by centuries of cautious hostility. Yet in the timeline where Julius Caesar evaded the dagger's tip, the frontier would not become a wound, but a seam. It would be stitched not with conquest alone, but with patience, calculation, and the subtle threading of diplomacy. The new eastern frontier, as later chroniclers would call it, was not a single line, but a mosaic of buffer zones, client states, and cooperative corridors. It was a living edge, sometimes hard, sometimes porous, but always managed with deliberate foresight by the Imperium Caesarense. Caesar, having long studied the Parthians with a general suspicion and a statesman's curiosity, knew that open conquest of their territory would be both costly and pyrrhic. The Parthian Empire, based in Persia and ruling from Ctesiphon, possessed no fewer than a dozen royal claimants at any given time, and its politics were as volatile as its deserts. Yet Caesar saw opportunity in this instability, not for domination, but for design. The first initiative came in 38 BCE, when Caesar dispatched a special envoy to the Parthian court, Gaius Trebonius Minor, a skilled negotiator with Eastern roots. His mission was not to demand tribute or territory, but to propose an unprecedented agreement, a non-aggression pact, coupled with the establishment of a shared trade authority in the Mesopotamian corridor. The Parthians, wary but intrigued, received Trebonius in the city of Hekatompelos. For nearly a year, the negotiations continued, measured, ceremonial, and draped in ambiguity. Gifts were exchanged, Roman wines and Hispano-Lusitanian silks in return for Parthian horses and turquoise. Philosophers debated theology, astrologers aligned calendars, and eventually terms were struck. The resulting pact, later inscribed on twin stelae in Seleucia and Antioch, established the Limes Euphratica, a formally recognized boundary along the Euphrates River, with agreed protocols for passage, commerce, and legal disputes. But more significantly, the treaty created the Concordium Orientale, or Eastern Concord, a bilateral commission of Roman and Parthian officials, empowered to manage matters of cross-border concern. This body, seated in the neutral city of Edessa, consisted of 12 permanent delegates, equally divided between the two empires. It met quarterly, and in time, became a fixture of the frontier's landscape. Through it, disputes were settled, tariffs adjusted, and minor rulers appointed or replaced. The genius of the Eastern Concord lay in its non-imperial logic. It did not claim to erase difference. Rather, it ritualized it, transforming potential hostility into manageable bureaucracy. Under the Concord's umbrella, the region between the Euphrates and the Tigris began to flourish. Known in imperial records as the Zona Amica, or Friendly Zone, this corridor of city-states, merchant towns, and caravanserais became the economic heart of the new frontier. Here, Roman traders mingled with Parthian diplomats. Jewish exiles settled beside Armenian metallurgists. Temples to Mithras stood near altars to Jupiter and Zoroastrian fire shrines. No one power reigned, yet all found profit. The Silk Road, which had once been a dangerous ambition, now became a plausible reality. Goods from as far as Han China and the Kushan Empire moved through the Zona Amica with relative ease, protected by local militias trained jointly by Roman options and Parthian spabadai. Infrastructure followed commerce. Caesar, ever the engineer of systems, authorized the construction of the Via Mesopotamica, a great overland route linking Antioch to the Persian Gulf. It passed through Palmyra, Dura Europos, Hatra, and Charax, with way stations modeled on those of the Cursus Publicus. This highway did more than move goods. It moved people, soldiers, scholars, magistrates, musicians, and with them moved ideas. One of the most remarkable developments of the new frontier was the fusion of Roman and Eastern educational systems. In the academies of Edessa and Palmyra, students studied both Latin rhetoric and Persian epic. Textbooks included excerpts from both Cicero and Ferdowsi. Astronomy, long a Parthian specialty, was incorporated into Roman naval training. Roman law students learned to navigate Parthian notions of royal justice. Even the calendar was adjusted. In 32 BCE, the Concordium adopted a dual-dated system for legal and commercial documents, using both the Julian and Seleucid calendars. This practical hybridity became emblematic of the frontier's unique status, not Roman, not Parthian, but concordant. Still, Caesar was no pacifist. He understood that peace must be backed by the credible threat of force. Thus, he commissioned the formation of the Legio Orientalis, a special multi-ethnic legion composed of Roman veterans, Syrian archers, Judean slingers, and Armenian cavalry. Stationed in Emesa and Nisibis, it served both as deterrent and as an emblem of frontier unity. Its standard, unusual in design, featured the Roman eagle on one side and a stylized griffin on the other, symbolizing Parthian nobility. The motto embroidered upon its banner read simply, Pax Custodita, peace guarded. This balance of strength and subtlety, of boundary and exchange, was maintained with remarkable success for over a generation. Between 30 and 10 BCE, the eastern frontier experienced no major wars. Incursions were rare and swiftly addressed. Minor border adjustments were handled through concordium arbitration. Not one full-scale Roman-Parthian battle occurred in this span, a historical anomaly. Yet the most profound effect of the new eastern frontier was psychological. The Roman worldview, once obsessed with the binary of civilized versus barbarian, began to shift. The East was no longer a mysterious menace, but a sophisticated partner. Parthian architecture influenced Roman baths. Persian textiles became a status symbol in Roman courts. Zoroastrian ethics found echoes in Stoic dialogues. Even religion was touched. In 22 BCE, the Temple of Concordia in Rome hosted a rare festival honoring Anahita, a Parthian deity of water and fertility, in parallel with Vesta. The ceremony was modest, but symbolically potent, a recognition that divinity, like power, need not be monopolized. Some conservative senators grumbled, but the people, merchants, veterans, settlers, embraced the new order. The eastern frontier, once feared, was now seen as a realm of opportunity. By the final years of Caesar's life, the frontier had become less a limit and more a threshold, an entry point into a new geopolitical imagination. Caesarion, following in his father's footsteps, would later expand the Concordia model to include Bactria and Sogdiana, forming what scholars would later call the Pax Trans-Euphratica, a broader piece encompassing the Iranian plateau. But its seed, its spark, its soul was planted here in the careful treaties and caravan routes of the Euphrates line. Thus, in the long arc of imperial strategy, the new eastern frontier stands as one of Caesar's quietest yet greatest achievements. He did not conquer the East. He connected to it. He did not extinguish Parthia. He engaged it. And in doing so, he redefined the very meaning of empire, not as dominion over the other, but as structured coexistence with the different. It was a lesson written not in blood, but in dust and bronze and parchment. And it endured. In the hush of morning fog that draped the port of Alexandria like a veil of muslin, ships creaked softly in their moorings and gulls wheeled in slow, drowsy arcs. The sea, dark as ink and still as a thought not yet spoken, stretched eastward to Syria and westward to Rome, carrying not only goods, but ideas, ambitions, and men whose minds sought to unravel the workings of gods and stars. And nestled along the water's edge, its white marble domes shimmering with dew, stood the most sacred temple of thought in the ancient world, the Imperial Academy of Alexandria. Founded not in haste, but in accumulated intention, the Academy was neither a wholly new institution nor a mere extension of the old Museum. It was an intellectual rebirth, commissioned by Julius Caesar and Queen Cleopatra as a conscious response to the transformations of their world. Where armies marched and borders shifted, they envisioned a different conquest, one of the mind. It began in 33 BCE when a formal edict, inscribed upon bronze in both Latin and Greek, was issued jointly from Rome and Alexandria. This decree, known as the Mandatum Scientiae, established the Academia Imperialis Alexandrina as a bicommunal institute of advanced study funded by the treasury of the empire and the royal house of Egypt in equal measure. Its mission was as ambitious as it was meticulous, to collect, classify, teach, and debate all known knowledge of the inhabited world, from the epicycles of Babylonian astronomy to the legal codes of Hispania, from the medical traditions of Nubia to the philosophical dialectics of Athens. No subject was deemed unworthy, no culture excluded. The academy was constructed atop the foundations of the old Museum, expanded outward like a mandala of marble and papyrus. It comprised 7 vast pavilions, each dedicated to a field of study and symbolically associated with one of the classical planets. The Pavilion of Mercury, devoted to logic, mathematics, and rhetoric. The Pavilion of Venus, dedicated to arts, literature, and music. The Pavilion of Mars, concerning military theory, engineering, and metallurgy. The Pavilion of Jupiter, focused on law, governance, and ethics. The Pavilion of Saturn, exploring history, language, and chronology. The Pavilion of Luna, reserved for natural philosophy, medicine, and biology. The Pavilion of Sol, the greatest of them all, housing astronomy, metaphysics, and the ceremonial archives. Each pavilion was an architectural masterpiece, adorned with mosaics, bronzes, and reliefs representing both Roman and Egyptian iconography. The Pavilion of Jupiter, for example, featured columns etched with scenes of Solon and Hammurabi, while its inner ceiling was painted with the 12 tables in golden Latin letters. The Pavilion of Venus boasted a chamber in which the walls were inscribed entirely with the Iliad and the Aeneid, alternating line by line, creating a hypnotic echo of East and West. Admission to the Academy was not open, but selective. A rigorous process, overseen by the Concilium Luminis, or Council of Light, admitted only those who passed a series of examinations, an oration in both Latin and Greek, a demonstration of numerical theory, and a written treatise on moral philosophy. Candidates came from all corners of the empire, from young patricians of Rome to Syrian scribes, Ethiopian geometers, Gallic physicians, and Nabatean poets. Once admitted, they were known not as students, but as discipuli imperi, disciples of the empire, and wore garments dyed in deep indigo, symbolizing wisdom and the Nile. They resided within the Domus Mentium, or House of Minds, a cloistered complex of quiet gardens, candlelit study halls, and observatories aligned with equinox and solstice. At the center of this world stood the Magister Maximus, a post granted only once every 10 years, after convocation of all 7 pavilions. The first to hold this title was Didymus Claudianus, a blind philosopher from Cyrene, renowned for having memorized the entirety of Aristotle's Organon. His lectures, delivered from memory, slow and musical, became legend, drawing visitors from as far as Mauritania and Armenia. The curriculum of the Academy was both vast and structured. Every disciple was required to complete the Trivium Magnus, a tripartite foundation in logic, history, and natural order, before specializing. Advanced disciplines included comparative jurisprudence, sacred geometry, astronomic harmonics, philological morphogenesis, and geopolitical theoria. A particular note was the Department of Linguarum Universitas, which developed the first standardized transliteration matrix, a system by which Latin, Greek, Demotic, and Old Persian could be reliably cross-referenced, creating the precursor to what modern historians might compare to an ancient linguistic algorithm. The Academy also maintained the Bibliotheca Nova, a new library designed in consultation with Egyptian priests and Roman engineers, built with fireproof stone and ventilated via subterranean aqueducts. Its scrolls were organized using the Codex Australis, a star-based indexing system that aligned each subject with a constellation, allowing scholars to read the heavens as a metaphor for navigating knowledge. In its first decade, the Imperial Academy began producing compendia, multi-volume encyclopedias on various subjects, distributed to provincial academies and libraries throughout the empire. The Compendium Militaris, written under the supervision of General Marcus Balbus, catalogued every known siege technique from Carthage to Bactria. The Medical Lexicon, compiled by Judean healer Anaya ben Elisheva, provided descriptions of over 700 medicinal herbs and their applications in both Roman and Egyptian traditions. These works bore the imperial seal, a hybrid image of the Roman eagle and the eye of Horus, encircled by the motto, Scientia Unitas Imperium, knowledge unites the empire. Beyond texts, the Academy also birthed debate. Every Saturn's Day, in the Auditorium Aureum, scholars gathered for the Controversiae Magnae, grand disputations on ethical, political, or metaphysical topics. These events were not mere displays of erudition. They were attended by provincial governors, senators, generals, and sometimes Caesar himself. Questions debated included, should law precede custom or custom law? Is virtue innate or cultivated? Can empire be just without unity of language? The effects of the Academy rippled outward. Governors began requiring academy credentials for their legal advisors. Architects integrated Ptolemaic proportions into Roman aqueduct design. Physicians returned to Gaul and Illyria with Egyptian surgical techniques. Even poets, once provincial, began referencing Babylonian epics and Chinese jade metaphors. In 24 BCE, the Academy hosted its most famous symposium, the Colloquium Orbis, or Gathering of the World. Delegates from over 20 provinces, as well as observers from Han China and the Indo-Greek kingdoms, presented their findings. The highlight was a joint demonstration by Roman astronomer Lucius Cassius Pollio and Babylonian stargazer Belshazzar, who together predicted a lunar eclipse to within 6 minutes accuracy, earning them the honorary title of Custodes Noctis, or Guardians of the Night. And yet, for all its grandeur, the Academy was also a place of quiet routines. Scribes copying manuscripts by oil lamp, mathematicians marking wax tablets with trembling styluses, teachers dictating Euclid beneath palm trees. Silent devotion to study, day after day, like prayer. In 16 BCE, Cleopatra's daughter, Julia Philometora, was named preceptrix aeternalis, or eternal tutor, overseeing the ethical curriculum and introducing courses on comparative theology, ritual aesthetics, and feminine logic. Under her leadership, the role of women in the Academy expanded considerably. By 12th BCE, nearly one-third of the discipuli were female. When Caesarion ascended to full imperial power, he commissioned the construction of satellite academies in Pergamon, Carthage, Massilia, and Eboracum, each modeled after the Alexandrian original, and each required to send annual scholars back to Alexandria to preserve ideological unity. And thus the academy became not a place alone, but a system, a cognitive infrastructure of empire. Its scrolls outlasted temples. Its diagrams survived earthquakes. Its graduates became not only governors and judges, but poets, engineers, and lawgivers. When modern historians later coined the phrase the Alexandrian Renaissance, they were referring not only to an era of intellectual flowering, but to a model of imperial governance rooted in scholarship, not merely swords. And in the quiet echo of marble halls, beneath ceiling maps of constellations and tiled depictions of Cicero and Ptah, there still lingers the ghost of that original dream, that an empire united in thought would prove more enduring than one united only by steel. In the twilight of Julius Caesar's reign, as the sun of his influence began to dip behind the horizon of age, and as the marble statues of his image began to crack not from revolution but from reverent erosion, the empire he had forged faced a question so old and yet so fragile: who shall follow? The answer, long whispered in the corridors of Alexandria, and finally uttered in public under the gilded coffered ceilings of the Roman Senate, came in the form of a name: Ptolemaeus Caesar, son of Cleopatra, known to the public as Caesarion. His rise was not sudden. It was a measured unfolding, like the unfurling of a scroll, word by deliberate word. Born in 47 BCE, during the high summer of Cleopatra's influence and Julius Caesar's apex of power, Caesarion bore within his veins the ambition of two worlds: the iron discipline of Rome and the mystical lineage of Egypt. Officially recognized by Caesar in a carefully worded edict issued in 44 BCE, one that avoided the word heir but did not avoid the implications, Caesarion was raised with a curriculum that could be described only as imperial in scope. He spent his early years in Alexandria, tutored by grammarians who taught him Latin with the rhythm of Virgil, Greek with the nuance of Thucydides, and Demotic Egyptian with the chants of priests. His philosophical training was overseen by Stoics imported from Rhodes, and his military instruction supervised by retired Roman centurions who taught him how to balance the sword with the scroll. By the time Caesarion reached the age of 15, he had completed the Trivium Alexandrinum, a path of learning that included rhetoric, metaphysics, and administrative jurisprudence, and had begun corresponding in his own name with provincial governors in Asia Minor, Hispania, and Cyrenaica. His letters, preserved in bronze plaques and waxed tablets, reveal a mind of precise calculation, a temperament diplomatic yet assertive, and a peculiar, almost rehearsed humility. In Rome, meanwhile, Julius Caesar began the delicate task of preparing the political terrain for what would become one of the most carefully choreographed successions in Roman history. Unlike the chaos that would have followed his assassination in another timeline, in this altered course of events, Caesar ruled long enough to engineer continuity. He knew Rome would not accept a king. It would not accept an Egyptian monarch. It might not even accept a child born of Cleopatra, but it could accept a Caesar, so long as that Caesar spoke Latin, paid his legions, and bowed, even if symbolically, to Roman tradition. To this end, Caesar gradually introduced Caesarion into Roman public life through a series of staged appearances. In 29 BCE, Caesarion made his first journey to Rome under the watchful eye of Senator Marcus Agrippa, and with the ceremonial escort of the Egyptian grain fleet. The journey itself was symbolic. The ships bore sails of indigo and gold, each emblazoned with the hybrid sigil of the empire, eagle and cobra entwined. Upon arrival, Caesarion was paraded not in triumphal fashion, but in academic procession. He walked beside the philosophers and jurists of Alexandria, not behind Caesar's chariot. This display, held not in the Forum Romanum, but in the open expanse of the Campus Martius, was described by the historian Lucius Sisenna as a spectacle of minds, not swords. Caesarion gave a speech in Latin, fluent, slow, deliberate, on the virtues of unified governance and the duties of rulers toward their people. He cited Livy and Plato. He quoted Augustus, though he had not yet existed in this timeline. That speech, copied and circulated by scribes, became the Discursus Campi, and was taught in imperial schools for centuries. Rome watched and waited. In the decade that followed, Caesarion undertook a tour of the provinces, accompanied by scholars, soldiers, and scribes. He visited the mines of Noricum, the harbors of Massilia, the temples of Ephesus. He studied tax records in Antioch and irrigation channels in Mauritania. Wherever he went, he offered no decrees, no demands. He observed, he learned, he memorized the empire as one memorizes a language, through immersion. In 25 BCE, he returned to Rome, this time as Prefectus Consiliorum, a specially created advisory role within Caesar's inner council. It was not unprecedented. Many young men of noble birth were given similar positions, but Caesarion's presence carried deeper weight. He was no longer a guest, he was being integrated. That same year, Caesar introduced a constitutional reform that modern historians call the lex successionis gradualis, the law of gradual succession. It allowed for the nomination of a princeps auxiliarius, a supporting first citizen, who would assume joint administrative duties during the natural aging or incapacity of the ruling princeps. It was, in all but name, the creation of a co-emperorship. In 22 BCE, after a formal Senate vote and a public oath taken on the Capitoline Hill, Caesarion was named Princeps Auxiliarius Caesarion Augustus. The second holder of Imperium Maius, granted limited veto power, oversight of the eastern provinces, and command of 2 legions, the Theti Gemina and the newly created Legio Alexandria. The ceremony was modest, as Caesar had instructed. There were no laurel crowns, no purple robes. Instead, Caesarion appeared in a simple toga, with a scroll in one hand and an olive branch in the other. The message was clear. His rule would be administrative, legal, and intellectual, not dynastic or divine. But the world understood differently. The provinces hailed Caesarion as son of Caesar and child of Isis. Temples in Egypt celebrated him as Neter Neferu, or living god of harmony. Statues in Cappadocia and Illyria began to depict the young man in the pose of a philosopher king, seated between an eagle and a lotus blossom. The symbolism was spreading like ink across parchment. Rome, however, remained cautious. Old Republican sentiments had not died, merely slumbered. Within the Senate, murmurs of discontent gathered like storm clouds. Some questioned the Egyptian influence. Others doubted Caesarion's capacity to govern an empire born of legions, not liars. But Caesar, now in his mid-60s and still mentally vigorous, addressed these murmurs directly in a speech known as the Oratio Concordiae, the Speech of Concord. Delivered in the Curia Julia, he reminded the senators that unity, not purity, preserved Rome, that the empire was now a tapestry, not a spear, and that Rome could not hold the world by iron alone. In 19 BCE, after a long and slow transition, Caesar formally retired from public administration, retaining only religious titles. Pontifex Maximus, and father of the Senate, Caesarion became the de facto ruler of the empire with Senate approval, public assent, and the quiet endorsement of the army. He did not take the title of imperator, nor dictator, nor rex. Instead, he chose a new title, crafted with care. Princeps Concordiae Orbis, first citizen of the harmony of the world. His first act was symbolic. He abolished the tax on scholarly texts and declared the Aurea Aetas Literarum, golden age of letters. In his edict, he wrote, "Where steel fails, the word endures. Let us bind the world not with chains, but with shared thought." Under his leadership, the imperial bureaucracy was reformed into departments of dialogue, in which every provincial decree required commentary by a council of local scholars. Governors were evaluated not only on tax collection, but on cultural integration and linguistic outreach. Caesarion's reign began as a conversation, not a conquest. The people of Rome, once suspicious, began to warm. Temples bore his image beside that of his father. Poets praised him in meter drawn from Homer and Horace alike. Children learned his name before they learned of Romulus. And throughout the empire, a strange phrase began to appear on coins, arches, and papyri. Pax Caesariana, the peace of Caesarion. It would last for generations. And thus the young boy who had once been dismissed as a foreign prince became the ruler of the greatest empire the world had known, not through war, but through patience, education, and the careful crafting of perception. In this timeline, there was no Augustus, no civil war, no purges. There was Caesar, then Caesarion, and between them, an empire not broken and reforged, but handed forward like a flame in the quiet dark. In the long procession of history, where wars often scream and victories sing, there are quieter moments, epochs not marked by bloodshed or boundary, but by paper, protocol, and pen. Such was the age that followed the accession of Caesarion, son of Caesar, to the Roman throne, an age of administration, of regulation, and of harmonized governance, in which Rome's greatness was preserved not by conquest, but by consistency. Historians would come to call this time the Aetas Aurea Administrativa, the golden age of administration, a term born not in poetry, but in the minutes of provincial meetings, in the rubrics of legal codes, and in the steady, scroll-bound rhythm of record-keeping that echoed from Britannia to Bactria. Caesarion's approach to governance was not flamboyant. It was precise, technocratic, and deeply structured. He believed that stability came not from heroism, but from habit. Under his rule, the institutions of Rome were neither glorified nor reimagined. They were perfected. The first major reform of his reign was the Universal Census Codification Act, or Lex Tabularum, passed in 17 BCE. Though censuses had long been conducted sporadically throughout the Republic and early empire, this law created a unified 5-year census schedule for the entire empire. It mandated standardized categories: citizen status, household size, taxable yield, military eligibility, educational literacy, and even local dialect. To enforce this, Caesarion created a new administrative class, the Officium Tabularium, or Bureau of Records, stationed in every province. These officials, known as tabulari imperii, were drawn from a new educational track housed within the Imperial Scholasticum, a school founded by Caesarion in Rome, with branches in Carthage, Antioch, and Massalia. The tabulari were not merely scribes. They were trained jurists, accountants, and linguists, instructed in how to interview villagers in distant dialects, how to assess land without local bias, and how to issue scrolls of official status that could be read from Numidia to Dalmatia. With these reforms, Rome became a paper empire, bound not by swords, but by seals, ledgers, and edicts. A family in Lusitania seeking land rights would have their documents recognized by a court in Syria. A merchant from Alexandria could present a trade certificate in Mediolanum without fear of mistranslation. This administrative fluency unified the empire more than any road or legion ever had. The second reform of Caesarion's golden administration focused on the juridical order. He expanded upon his father's lex Julia, reorganizing the entire judicial system under a new hierarchy: curiae propriae, or personal courts, for local and civil disputes, and curiae imperialis, or imperial courts, for interprovincial or state matters. Each court operated under a praetor juris, trained at the Curia Juridica Caesariana, a new school of law attached to the Senate itself, with a faculty composed of seasoned magistrates and legal philosophers from across the empire. Court rulings were recorded, indexed, and circulated as precedents, creating the earliest forms of what modern scholars might call case law. To manage appeals, Caesarion established the Concilium Finalis, a supreme appellate body seated in Rome and staffed not by patricians, but by a rotating council of 12 jurists, elected annually by a joint vote of the Senate and the provincial assemblies. The presence of provincial assemblies, Concilium Provinciae, was another of Caesarion's quiet revolutions. Though advisory in nature, these assemblies gave formal voice to non-Roman subjects. In cities from Thessalonica to Tarsus, representatives were elected not by wealth but by occupation. A stonemason could rise as a delegate beside a merchant. A fisherman might debate a city governor on water rights. These bodies could not pass laws, but they could issue memoranda, propose regional edicts, and petition Rome directly. And they did so in growing volume, year after year. But perhaps the most admired reform of Caesarion's reign, and certainly the most studied by modern historians, was the creation of the Imperial Office of Harmonization, or Officium Concordiae. The task of this office was deceptively simple: to ensure that every edict, policy, calendar, and festival was aligned across the empire, that what was true in Rome was not false in Tyre, that a decree written in Greek did not contradict its Latin twin, and that regional customs were harmonized, not homogenized. This office published the Codex Ordinum, an annual almanac of all imperial regulations, religious observances, legal clarifications, and civic expectations. It was bound in dyed calfskin and distributed to every major municipal archive, where it was read aloud during public assemblies. Under Caesarion, time itself became standardized. He built upon his father's Julian calendar, refining it to incorporate local solar and lunar corrections, producing what became known as the Concordian calendar, which included feast days for both Roman and local deities, agricultural markers, and dates of legal permissibility for specific contracts. Even the Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, was overhauled. Relay stations were spaced with mathematical regularity. New roads, now built with a triple-layer method pioneered in Syria, allowed for smoother travel. Messages carried by imperial riders could traverse from Lugdunum to Alexandria in just 28 days, an astonishing efficiency for the age. These riders carried more than messages. They carried compliance ledgers, annual summaries, and provincial mood reports, compiled from interviews with locals and readings of graffiti and amphitheater chants. Caesarion believed that a ruler who listened too late was a ruler already lost. In economic matters, too, his reign was marked by method. The Aureus Stabilitas Act of 15 BCE fixed the value of the aureus and denarius against a weight-based scale rather than market rate, ending decades of inflationary volatility. Coinage was reminted with imperial seals of quality, and treasury audits became a quinquennial norm. Caesarion's policy was not simply centralization, it was predictability. He understood that merchants, soldiers, farmers, and scholars, all classes, preferred known hardship to unknown fortune. And so he built a state where taxes were foreseeable, where permits could be anticipated, and where the rule of law stretched evenly from the docks of Britannia to the gates of Babylon. This did not make his reign popular in the way of conquerors. It made it respected. Children were named after him not for glory, but for stability. Coins bore his face with the inscription Princeps Orbis Legibus, first citizen by the laws of the world. In temples, his name was invoked not in prayers for victory, but for fairness. In markets, his image was hung above weight scales, not altars. By the time Caesarion reached the age of 40, his system had become so embedded in Roman consciousness that a generation of citizens had never known a time when an appeal could be lost in translation, when a court ruling differed by region, or when a census failed to arrive on schedule. This, in many ways, was his true conquest, not of lands or peoples, but of chaos itself. The golden administration did not glitter. It ticked like a clock, precise and unassuming. But its effect was vast. Under Caesarion, Rome was not louder. It was quieter, more orderly, more human. And so the son of Julius Caesar, the child once dismissed as a foreign curiosity, became not a Caesar of fire, but a Caesar of form. Where his father had carved the empire, Caesarion framed it. And in the long annals of Rome, his reign would not be remembered for the blood he spilled, but for the forms he filled, the ledgers he signed, and the world he gently organized into harmony. If the golden administration of Caesarion provided the body of the empire with circulation, structure, and coherence, then the Roman Renaissance of science and letters gave it its soul. This was not a Renaissance in the retrospective sense of rebirth from oblivion, but rather a Renaissance of expansion, of inquiry, of method, and of textual life. It did not reject the old. It measured it, cataloged it, annotated it, and extended it across disciplines and distances once thought intellectually barren. The seeds of this flowering had long been buried in the loam of conquest. Alexandria, Pergamon, Athens, Antioch, and Carthage, all these were cities of culture, subdued but not silenced. With the decline of constant warfare and the ascent of bureaucratic peace, a new rhythm settled over the empire, one in which the scroll replaced the sword and the stylus surpassed the spear. At the heart of this intellectual blooming stood the Imperial Academy of Alexandria, fully reconstituted under Caesarion's mandate in 12th BCE, and placed under the joint supervision of the Officium Concordiae and the Office of Imperial Letters. It was no longer simply a library, nor merely a museum of Hellenistic relics, but a complex of research forums, observatories, anatomical theaters, translation studios, lecture halls, and experimental gardens. Its motto, carved in Latin and Greek across the main vestibule, read, Querit et conoscit, seek and know. The academy's structure was itself innovative. It was not divided by discipline alone, but by methodology. Scholars were grouped into 5 collegia: theorists, practitioners, translators, interpreters, and verifiers. These collegia worked in collaborative tension. No theory could be circulated unless interpreted by philosophers, translated into at least 2 imperial tongues, and verified through experiment or external citation. Thus, Alexandria became the nerve center of methodological inquiry. Among its most illustrious minds was Cassia Priscilla, a mathematician from Baetica, who produced the first trigonometric tables calibrated for land surveying in mountainous terrain, an innovation that dramatically improved imperial mapping. Her treatise, Tabulae Elevationis, was copied in over 70 provincial scriptoria within a decade. Alongside her labored Timarchus of Thebes, a natural philosopher who advanced an early theory of atmospheric pressure by conducting sealed amphorae experiments at various altitudes along the slopes of Mount Argaeus. Though his measurements were imprecise by modern standards, his conclusion that air bears weight upon the earth in invisible form would echo through centuries. In the realm of medicine, the Academy nurtured the controversial but prolific figure Livia Galenica, a descendant of Greek lineage who combined anatomical observations from battlefield hospitals with controlled vivisections of animals. She pioneered a theory of internal pulsed currents, a precursor to understanding blood circulation, though her terminology was enmeshed in humoral tradition. Her rival, Decimus Aelius of Massalia, took a more botanical approach. His monumental work, De Herbis Medicis Imperii, cataloged over 800 plant species, including their regional variations, cultivation methods, and medicinal applications. This work became a cornerstone of imperial pharmacology, with copies standardized by the Officium Concordiae and integrated into every provincial infirmary. But science did not flourish alone. Literature, too, surged forward, shedding the weight of Ciceronian imitation and embracing a new imperial style, less rhetorical, more observational, less about glory, more about process. Chief among this literary school was Manius Valerius Symmachus, whose 24-volume Annales Provinciae chronicled the lives of ordinary Roman citizens across every province: merchants in Cappadocia, pearl divers in Cyrenaica, scribes in Mauritania, and vintners in Gallia Narbonensis. His writing was pedestrian by senatorial standards, but his attention to daily rhythms and local detail captured something no conquest ever could: the texture of Roman life. His counterpart in verse was Lucilla of Leptis Magna, whose Cantica Fluviorum, Songs of the Rivers, offered meditative poetry on every major river of the empire. These were not hymns to gods, but to hydrology, descriptions of eddies, flood cycles, erosion patterns, and the moods of mist and delta. In her work, one finds the genesis of a new aesthetic science, the blending of empirical attention with poetic form. Translation efforts likewise reached unprecedented scale. The Academy's Translators Collegium, under the direction of Zenas Philadelphus, embarked on a 40-year mission to render the entire Corpus Philosophicum, from Plato to Chrysippus, into Latin, Punic, Syriac, and even primitive forms of Gothic and Aramaic. This was not merely dissemination. It was assimilation, a conscious imperial strategy of intellectual unity through multilingual literacy. So pervasive was this strategy that even children's primers were printed in parallel columns, introducing students to dual language logic from their first inscriptions. Yet the most ambitious intellectual venture of this Renaissance was the imperial catalogue of all known things, or Catalogus Omnium Rerum Cognitarum, a sprawling encyclopedic initiative begun in 6 BCE under Caesarion's personal sponsorship. This encyclopedia, compiled over 33 years and completed by his successor, was divided into 7 master volumes: De Natura, on the natural world, De Corpore Humano, on the human body, De Terra et Caelo, on the earth and heavens, De Animalibus, on animals, De Machinis, on machines, De Litteris et Lingua, on language and letters, De Institutis Humani, on the institutions of man. Each volume included diagrams, glossaries, marginalia, and citations to known texts, oral traditions, and verified experiments. Its prologue bore a simple but haunting dedication: "For those not yet born, that they may remember we sought to understand." The Renaissance also produced critical advances in measurement. Time was further refined by water clocks, synchronized with calibrated sundials positioned along major imperial routes. A standardized imperial hour was adopted, allowing ship captains, astronomers, and governors to coordinate activity with remarkable precision. Even sound was studied. In 4 BCE, the Collegium Sonorum in Antioch published treatises on the relationship between pipe lengths and pitch, primitive acoustic science, which laid the groundwork for new musical instruments and innovations in amphitheater design. Meanwhile, in a quiet laboratory atop the Academy's Northern Observatory, a man named Petronius Labeo developed the first comparative study of celestial parallax, using dual-angled mirrors to track stars across the horizon. He concluded, tentatively and buried in an appendix, that the Earth might not be the fixed center of the universe. His notes were quietly archived and only rediscovered centuries later. This was the nature of the Roman Renaissance. It did not shout. It recorded, measured, tabulated, and speculated. It left behind not monuments of marble, but paper trails, careful, cautious, compelling. It was a culture where knowledge was no longer the privilege of the elite, but the inheritance of all who could read, recite, or replicate. And with every new volume, every new term coined in Latin or Greek or Punic, the empire wove a tapestry not of flags or banners, but of questions, observations, and provisional answers. Rome, for a brief and brilliant time, became the library of the world, not because it knew all things, but because, for once, it was willing to ask. Throughout history, the greatest threat to an enduring empire has never been invasion from without, but rupture from within, most often born in the shadows of succession. For every towering ruler who shaped the future with vision, there emerged the old, familiar specter of dynastic uncertainty, ambition without restraint, and the fatal gamble of inheritance. In Rome's actual timeline, the death of emperors regularly birthed chaos, usurpations, legions turning upon legions, the Praetorian Guard selling the throne to the highest bidder, provinces cleaving away in blood. But under Caesarion, heir of Julius Caesar, son of Cleopatra, first philosopher-king of the harmonized empire, succession did not provoke cataclysm. It unfolded like administration, as planned and methodical as a census form. Caesarion had observed firsthand the calamities of Roman succession, how his father's assassination had nearly drowned the Republican Civil War, how Augustus had secured peace only by accumulating power so total that it became indistinguishable from monarchy, how even the early Julio Claudians, cloaked in titles like princeps, could not escape the dynastic curse. Thus, from the earliest years of his reign, Caesarion devoted himself not only to governing well, but to dying wisely. His solution would come to be known as the Succession Codex, or Codex Hereditatis Imperii, a living legal document revised over the course of 30 years. It was not a will, but a constitutional mechanism, a framework for legitimate transfer of power grounded in law, merit, and consent, rather than blood alone. The Codex introduced a threefold structure for imperial succession: primus designatus, the designated first successor, publicly named by the emperor, vetted by the Senate, and ratified by the Concilium Provinciarum; secundus confirmatus, The confirmed second, a vice-regent chosen by a rotating council of provincial governors to assume regency in case of premature death or incapacity of the primus. Tertia custodia, the third custodian, an elder statesman or stateswoman appointed to act as moral overseer and legal arbiter of transition, drawn from the judicial class and confirmed by the concilium finalis. These roles were not secret. They were made public, etched into bronze tablets at major fora, and reiterated in each edition of the Codex Ordinum, the annual legal almanac of the empire. Caesarion's choice for primus designatus was his eldest daughter, Julia Serapina Caesariana, a woman of formidable intellect, fluent in 5 languages, and trained from adolescence in jurisprudence, military theory, and statecraft. Though female succession was without precedent in Roman history, Caesarion ensured she was publicly co-consul with him for 8 years prior to his death, appearing in senatorial addresses, presiding over court disputes, and issuing edicts under joint seal. His selection of Julia caused no rebellion. This was not because the Romans had suddenly become egalitarian, but because they had become procedural. The empire had been conditioned, through decades of bureaucracy, to accept systems over sentiment, process over prejudice. Julia's secundus confirmatus was her cousin and military tribune, Tiberius Claudianus, a figure palatable to both the army and the old senatorial class. He was deliberately chosen not for charisma, but for competence. Trained as a field commander, but also as a mediator, fluent in provincial dialects and known for his restraint during campaigns in Armenia and Mauritania. The tertia custodia, appointed in Julia's 26th year, was Domitia Longina Vetra, an elderly jurist from Tarraco who had spent 4 decades as provincial judge. Her role, quiet but critical, was to serve as guardian of legitimacy, to rule on disputes of succession procedure, and serve as ceremonial guidepost during coronation rites. The coronation itself was transformed. No longer a single declaration or military acclamation, succession became a multi-stage rite. Upon the death of Caesarion, peaceful and expected at age 69, the following sequence unfolded as prescribed: the Lamentatio Imperii, a 10-day observance of mourning in all provinces, marked by silence of the courts, black banners in public spaces, and the closing of temples. It was not religious mourning, but civic. The confirmation tribune, Julia Serapina, stood before the Senate and read aloud the final amendment to the Succession Codex, co-signed by Caesarion. She received the fasces consulares from the praetor urbanus in a symbolic handing over, rather than proclamation by soldiers. The provincial echo, governors across all 38 provinces, replicated the rite, reading the codex aloud in their forms and dispatching sealed oaths of loyalty, each co-signed by the Concilium Provinciae. The insignium unitas. Julia was formally invested with the 5 emblems of imperial unity: the ivory seal, administration; the laurel diadem, command; the censor's stylus, law; the torch of concordia, culture; and the mirror of Minerva, intellect. These were crafted new for her reign, symbolic and non-religious. The Edict of Continuance. Within 72 hours of ascension, the new empress was required to issue a binding declaration of administrative continuity, affirming all standing laws, magistracies, and provincial charters, unless explicitly amended. This prevented destabilization by purges or immediate reforms. The ceremony was choreographed not for grandeur, but for clarity. Its message was, the empire does not pivot on the life of one ruler. It turns on law, logic, and ledger. And so Julia Serapina assumed power without a single drop of blood spilled. There were no legions marching on Rome, no senatorial conspiracies, no pretenders raising standards in distant camps. The very design of Caesarion's state had rendered civil war, not impossible, but irrelevant. This moment, unremarkable to later generations who took its smoothness for granted, would come to be recognized by scholars as the turning point of continuity. A pivot in world history where power passed not with thunder, but with ink. Under Julia's early reign, the institutions of succession were not only preserved, but quietly expanded. She established the Archivum Successionis, a permanent record office detailing every stage of each transition, with annotations, testimonies, and procedural audits. Future generations of rulers would be measured not by the grandiosity of their reign, but by the elegance of their succession. Later, historians, writing under the Republica Concordiana centuries later, would marvel at this era and call it the post-Caesarian consensus. And in comparing it to the chaotic years of emperors past, of Nero and Galba, of civil strife and praetorian auctions, they would ask, almost in disbelief, how did it not happen sooner? But they would know the answer. It did not happen sooner because Rome had not yet learned to love order over spectacle, systems over saviors, and the rule of measured succession over the drama of the sword. For centuries, the Rhine and the Danube had formed not merely geographic barriers, but psychological and cultural frontiers, edges of the known, the civilized, and the administrated. To the west of these rivers lay roads, aqueducts, tax records, and treaties. To the east, forests and firelight, tribal chieftains, barter economies, and oral law. Germania, never fully tamed, never fully mapped, was a canvas of unpredictability, fertile with potential, yet tangled in the thorns of its own fragmentation. But under the long peace and bureaucratic ambition of Caesarion's legacy, Germania was not merely invaded. It was absorbed in stages so slow and intricate that neither Romans nor Germans quite realized it was happening until they were each fluent in the customs of the other. It began not with legions, but with ledgers. In 7 CE, during the third year of Empress Julia Serapina's reign, the Officium Transrhenanum was founded, a special administrative body dedicated solely to the Rhine frontier. Its initial mission was modest, to document all known trade routes used by tribes east of the Rhine, record population estimates, and produce dialect maps of the region. Its lead agent, Marcus Atticus Vernus, was a former provincial notary with a gift for languages and a remarkable tolerance for damp climates. Vernus's approach was ethnographic rather than military. He recruited local informants, mostly semi-Romanized merchants and itinerant priests, to catalog everything from tribal marriage customs to units of cattle exchange. Within a decade, the Compendium Gentes Germaniae was complete, a 600-page manuscript listing every known tribe, its known leaders, seasonal movements, dialectical peculiarities, and approximate loyalty to Rome. But knowledge was not enough. Integration required infrastructure. Rome's first major investment was not in roads or forts, but in market towns, known as Emporia Concordiae, positioned just beyond the traditional boundary lines. These towns were deliberately constructed in tribal style, with longhouses and animal pens, but operated under Roman legal contracts. They served as zones of economic entanglement, where Germanic chieftains traded furs, timber, and amber in exchange for Roman tools, wine, salt, and most curiously, legal advice. Law, it turned out, was the most persuasive export of all. By 12 CE, the Office of Provincial Law had authorized the issuance of tribal codicils, customized contracts that blended Roman property law with Germanic customary dispute resolution. These codicils formalized previously oral traditions into written agreements, which could then be stored in public record houses on wax tablets and papyrus. Literacy rates among the elite tribal class rose rapidly, with many sending their sons, and later daughters, to study in auxiliary schools of jurisprudence in Colonia, Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, modern Cologne. Rome had learned a vital lesson from previous rebellions. A people with a stake in their own records are less likely to revolt. Militarily, Rome did not abandon the legions, but recast their role. By 15 CE, Empress Julia had authorized the transformation of 3 Rhine-based legions into the Custodia Concordis, Guards of Harmony. These legions were hybridized formations, composed of Roman officers, provincial auxiliaries, and Germanic volunteers, each trained not only in combat, but in diplomatic protocol, engineering, and rudimentary mediation. They were less an army than a mobile administration force, their camps resembling administrative outposts more than war forts. They built bridges, repaired roads, resolved disputes between clans, and taught irrigation techniques learned in Hispania and Africa Proconsularis. Slowly, a different image of Rome took hold, not the iron fist, but the open ledger. This shift culminated in the Treaty of the Oak and Laurel, signed in 23 CE between the Roman Concordium and 12 Germanic tribal confederations, including the Cherusci, Chatti, and Marsi. This treaty was not a surrender nor a vassal arrangement, but a juridical fusion. Tribal leaders retained internal governance, but agreed to adopt Roman frameworks for intertribal disputes, inheritance law, and border taxation. In return, their elite families were granted partial citizenship, civitas composita, allowing their children to attend Roman academies and hold minor magistracies in frontier provinces. Over time, this citizenship expanded. By 35 CE, under Emperor Tiberius Claudianus, the Lex Concordia Germanica was passed, allowing full Roman citizenship to any Germanic family who had maintained 5 years of tax compliance, record-keeping, and bilingual contract filings. Entire villages began to qualify. Roman temples were built next to tribal shrines, not in replacement, but in parallel. Religious syncretism flourished. In the former sacred groves of the Teutoburg forest, altars were erected not to Jupiter or Mars alone, but to Jupiter Donar and Mars Tiwaz, hybrid deities honoring both pantheons. The priesthood of these shrines was mixed and multilingual, issuing oracles and judgments in both Latin and Old High German. Even more tellingly, Roman poets began to take interest in Germanic verse structures. The Cantica Borealis, compiled by the poetess Livia of Mogontiacum, was a collection of adapted tribal chants rendered in dactylic hexameter. She wrote, "The forest has its rhythm, and we must listen to it in our own tongue." Rome had learned to listen. By mid-century, Germania Prima and Germania Secunda were formalized as imperial provinces, not through conquest, but through graduated recognition. Their governors were often half Germanic by ancestry, fluent in native dialects, and appointed by combined senatorial and provincial councils. The frontier became less a wall and more a tapestry of identities, interwoven threads of Rome and forest, wax tablet and rune, tunic and cloak, grape and barley. Bilingual education became standard. Architectural styles merged, with Roman domes rising from timber foundations. Even funerary customs began to blend, with stone sarcophagi inscribed in both alphabets and adorned with both laurel and oak leaves. The great irony was that, in integrating Germania, Rome became less Roman in appearance, but more Roman in principle, not an empire of uniformity, but of federated legality and procedural unity. The very idea of Romanness became conceptual rather than ethnic or aesthetic. What Germania had resisted in iron, it accepted in parchment. And so the boundary that had once defined Rome's limits, its furthest reach and greatest frustration, became the axis of its transformation. A place where Latin was spoken with a northern lilt, where Roman calendars were kept alongside tribal lunar charts, where senators debated with braided hair and furs worn beneath togas. In integrating Germania, the empire learned the ultimate lesson of Caesarion's legacy, that an empire need not conquer to grow, nor erase to unify. It need only keep meticulous records, treat its allies as future citizens, and write its laws in many tongues. It begins, as many profound shifts do, so quietly that no single historian could date its start with precision. There was no proclamation, no triumphal parade, no coin minted with new slogans to mark it. The long peace, that delicate, enduring thread of harmony, was not announced. It was noticed. Noticed first in the ledgers of provincial tax collectors, where rebellion expenses gave way to irrigation budgets. Noticed in the dispatches of governors who found themselves writing fewer requests for legions and more for teachers. Noticed in the silence of borderlands where, once, drums of war had sounded with seasonal regularity. By 60 CE, some 70 years after Julius Caesar had narrowly escaped assassination, the Roman Empire had ceased to expand through war. Its borders were not static, but fluid in another direction, cultural, legal, institutional. Ideas radiated outward with the quiet efficiency of census clerks and notaries. Roads carried not legions, but grain, books, and the dialects of provinces long since woven into the administrative fabric. The period, later referred to by scholars as the Concordian Order, had arrived. Under Empress Julia Serapina, Emperor Tiberius Claudianus, and later their successors from the Domus Concordia, the imperial project had been redefined. No longer a tale of conquest and tribute, but of standardization, record-keeping, and cosmopolitan administration. A city in Lusitania could now calculate its local taxes on the same form used in Judea. A merchant in the highlands of Thrace could lodge a contract dispute with a Roman arbitrator in Alexandria and expect a hearing within 3 months. A noble family from the Rhineland could educate its children in Latin logic, Greek geometry, and Egyptian astronomy under a syllabus standardized by the Collegium Sapientiae Universalis. Peace in this context was not merely the absence of war, it was the codification of interdependence. The Pax Concordiana, as later historians would name it, lasted not 50, not 100, but nearly 400 years. It was not uninterrupted. There were droughts, secessions, tensions, but it was structurally resilient. The imperial bureaucracy had become a self-repairing organism. Local crises were absorbed through layers of regional mediation and layered redundancies. A failed harvest in Africa Proconsularis might trigger emergency grain shipments from Pontus or Sicilia, coordinated by the Frumentary Logisticum, a department more vital than any legion. By the early 2nd century, a generation of citizens had grown up with no living memory of civil war. Education played a central role. The universal curriculum included not only rhetoric, arithmetic, and law, but also historical memory. Every pupil was taught not only the glories of Rome, but the dangers of unchecked ambition, factionalism, and constitutional rupture. Caesar's survival had not produced hagiography, but institutional reflection. A bronze plaque installed in every major forum read, "Let no office forget its limits. Let no man rise without consent." Technology advanced in slow, steady increments, refinements rather than revolutions. The hydraulic wheel became widespread across provincial mills, tripling grain efficiency in frontier settlements. The heliocentric model, once a fringe idea, was accepted in astronomical schools in Carthage and Ephesus by 130 CE. Maritime innovations allowed regular circumnavigation of Africa's coasts, with trade routes reaching as far as the spice ports of the Indian subcontinent. Rome did not conquer the world, but it charted it, documented it, corresponded with it. Ambassadors from the Han dynasty were received in Alexandria and Ravenna. Maps were annotated with Tibetan passes and Sarmatian steppe alliances. Languages were cataloged and placed into grammatical concordances, allowing the gradual construction of multilingual legal codes. By 180 CE, the empire had established a series of global collegia, cultural and intellectual embassies, in places not under direct Roman rule: Kush, Axum, Parthia, even distant lands across the sea west of Iberia, as rumored in merchant logs. These institutions were not imperial missions, but offices of mutual understanding, issuing shared glossaries, trade tariffs, and scientific exchanges. Peace had made the empire curious. Even within Rome itself, once the gravitational center of the political cosmos, the focus had shifted from sovereignty to coordination. The Senate had become an executive coordinating council, overseeing the network of concilia provinciae, provincial senates with real legislative weight. Laws passed in Byzantium or Carthago could influence policy in Narbonensis or Britannia. The capital had become decentralized, its soul distributed across a latticework of cities connected by protocol rather than conquest. And yet, for all the abstraction of empire, it remained personal in the lives of its citizens. In a modest villa outside Lugdunum, a retired notary taught his grandchildren both Latin and Gallic poetry. In a bustling port of Neapolis, a Berber merchant discussed contracts with a Jewish financier and a Greek shipbuilder, all in the shared language of Roman commerce. In a marble hall in Antioch, a senator debated a jurist from Numidia on the inclusion of tribal precedent in imperial code. These were not anomalies, they were the norm. Had Julius Caesar died in 44 BCE, stabbed by men who feared a monarchy, perhaps this empire would have remained forever chained to its sword, to imperators and civil war, to saviors and collapses. But by surviving, by choosing consolidation over charisma, Caesar had planted a seed. That seed had grown, not into a tree of empire, but a grove of systems, durable and varied, each reinforcing the other through protocol, precedent, and polyglot consensus. Historians of the Fourth Era, writing from the libraries of Nova Roma in the Andean provinces, would later reflect on the sheer improbability of it all. They would marvel not merely at the survival of Rome, but at its metamorphosis, from a republic to an autocracy to a federated bureaucracy and finally to a global latticework of distributed civilizational governance. They would walk among ruins, not of collapse, but of continuous adaptation. And they would conclude, as the marble plaques in every city still read, Pax est concilium longum. Peace is the long plan.